They chained him like an animal in the center of the parade ground, and Eleanor Whitmore watched from her father's window as the soldiers took turns with their fists. The young Apache prisoner never cried out. Not once. Blood darkened the dust beneath his knees, but his eyes, black as obsidian, fierce as lightning, never broke. Eleanor's hands trembled against the glass. In 3 days, she would marry Victor Harlan, the richest land speculator in the territory. In 3 days, her life would be decided. But right now, in this moment, something inside her chest cracked open, like a fault line, splitting stone. If you're watching from somewhere in this world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay until the end. You won't believe where this goes. Tempt. The morning sun baked the parade ground of Fort Coyote Ridge into a furnace of white dust and silence. Eleanor stood at the second-floor window of the command house, her fingers pressed against the wavering glass, watching the scene below with a sickness rising in her throat that she couldn't name and didn't dare speak aloud. The prisoner knelt in the center of the courtyard. His wrists were shackled to an iron post driven deep into the ground, his arms pulled taut behind him in a position that must have screamed agony through his shoulders. He wore nothing but torn canvas trousers, his torso bare and already striped with bruises that darkened from purple to black in the relentless heat. Dust clung to his sweat-slicked skin. Flies circled. He was Apache, maybe 20 years old, maybe younger. It was hard to tell through the damage. Sergeant Cord Warren circled him slowly, a riding crop tapping against his thigh in rhythm with his boot steps. Warren was a thick-shouldered man with a face like cured leather and eyes the color of dirty ice. He'd been at the fort longer than Eleanor had been alive, and he moved with the casual confidence of someone who'd broken men before and would break men again. "Let's try this one more time, boy," Warren's voice carried across the silent courtyard. Every soldier on morning duty had stopped to watch. "You tell me where your people are hiding, and this gets easier for you." The prisoner said nothing. His head hung forward, long black hair falling across his face, but his breathing was steady, controlled. Warren's crop lashed out and struck him across the shoulders. The crack echoed like a gunshot. Eleanor flinched. The prisoner did not. "You think you're tough?" Warren circled closer, leaning down until his mouth was near the prisoner's ear. "You think silence makes you brave? I've broken harder men than you, savage. I've broken them until they begged me to let them talk." Still nothing. The prisoner's fingers curled slowly into fists, the chains rattling faintly, but he didn't lift his head. Warren straightened, rolled his shoulders, and nodded to the two privates standing nearby. "String him up higher. Let's see how long he stays quiet when his shoulders pop." "Sergeant Warren." The voice cut through the heat like a blade through silk. Every head turned. Colonel Nathaniel Whitmore stood on the command house steps, his uniform immaculate despite the dust and heat, his iron-gray hair combed back severely from a face that might have been carved from granite. He descended the steps with measured precision, his boots striking the wooden planks in a steady cadence that made grown men straighten their spines. Warren stepped back immediately, lowering the crop. "Sir, that's enough for now." Colonel Whitmore's gaze swept across the courtyard, taking in every soldier, every watching face, before settling on the prisoner. "Put him in the stockade. No food, no water. Let him think about his situation." "Sir, with respect, if we press him now—" "I said that's enough, Sergeant." The colonel's voice didn't rise, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. "We have time. The execution isn't scheduled until Sunday. 3 days to extract what we need. Patience wins wars, Warren. Remember that." Warren's jaw tightened, but he snapped a salute. "Yes, sir." The colonel turned and walked back toward the command house, his gaze lifting briefly to the second-floor window where Eleanor stood. Their eyes met for half a heartbeat. Then he was inside, the door closing behind him with a sound like a coffin lid. Eleanor's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her skirts, willing them to stop, but they wouldn't. Below, the soldiers were unlocking the prisoner's chains from the post, hauling him to his feet. He swayed, but didn't fall. Even now, even broken and bleeding, he stood. Warren shoved him toward the stockade, a windowless stone shed at the edge of the compound. The prisoner stumbled, caught himself, kept walking. His shoulders were rigid with pain, but his steps were steady. Eleanor watched until the stockade door slammed shut. watched until the soldiers dispersed, watched until the parade ground was empty again except for the post and the chains and the blood-dark dust. Then she turned away from the window and tried to pretend her hands had stopped shaking. The command house dining room smelled of furniture polish and coffee. Eleanor sat across from her father at the long mahogany table, a plate of untouched breakfast growing cold in front of her. The colonel read the morning dispatch reports with the same methodical attention he gave everything, his coffee cup raised and lowered at precise intervals. "You were watching from the window," he said without looking up. It wasn't a question. Eleanor knew better than to deny it. "Yes, father." And? She chose her words carefully. It seemed harsh. Now he did look up. His pale blue eyes studied her with the same analytical distance he might use to assess a new rifle or a supply manifest. "The prisoner is a hostile combatant, Eleanor, an Apache scout who participated in the raid on the Culver homestead. 3 people died in that raid, 2 of them children." Eleanor's throat tightened. She'd heard about the Culver massacre. Everyone had. The images the soldiers described had given her nightmares for weeks. "I understand," she said quietly. "Do you?" Her father set down his coffee cup with a soft click. "Because from where I stood, it looked like you were questioning the necessity of Sergeant Warren's interrogation." "I wasn't questioning." She stopped, breathed, started again. "I only thought that perhaps there might be another way to—" "There isn't." The colonel's voice was flat, final. "Men like that prisoner don't respond to kindness, Eleanor. They respond to strength, to consequences. The frontier is not a place for soft hearts or pretty ideals. It's a place where hard men do hard things so that women like you can sleep safely at night." Eleanor lowered her gaze to her plate. A piece of bacon sat in a pool of congealing grease. Her stomach turned. "Victor is arriving this afternoon," her father continued, returning to his reports. "He's bringing the final contracts for the land acquisition. I expect you to be present at dinner tonight, properly dressed, properly behaved. This arrangement is important, Eleanor, for the fort, for the territory, for our family. Do you understand?" "Yes, father." "Good." He turned a page. "And Eleanor." "Yes?" "Stay away from the stockade. That prisoner is dangerous. Even chained, men like him find ways to hurt people. I won't have you taking foolish risks out of misguided compassion." Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. Her father went back to his reading. Dismissed without another word, Eleanor rose from the table, her breakfast abandoned, and walked out into the hallway. Her footsteps echoed on the polished wooden floors. The sound felt too loud, like her heartbeat, like the crack of Warren's crop against skin. She climbed the stairs to her room and closed the door behind her. Eleanor's bedroom was a carefully constructed lie. Lace curtains filtered the harsh sunlight into something soft and golden. A 4-poster bed draped in white linens stood against one wall. A vanity cluttered with perfume bottles and hair ribbons occupied another. Watercolor paintings of flowers hung in gilt frames. Everything was delicate, feminine, refined. Everything was exactly what a colonel's daughter should have. Eleanor hated it. She crossed to the window, not the one overlooking the parade ground, but the smaller one facing east toward the distant mountains. The Sangre de Cristo range rose like broken teeth against the pale sky, snow-capped even in summer, impossibly remote. Sometimes Eleanor dreamed of those mountains, dreamed of walking into them and never coming back. But that was a child's fantasy. She was 22 years old enough to know that dreams didn't change reality, and reality was a wedding in 3 days to a man she barely knew and didn't love. Victor Harlan. The name tasted like copper in her mouth. She'd met him exactly 4 times. Once at a territorial governor's reception in Santa Fe, where he'd complimented her dress and her father's command with equal enthusiasm. Once at a 4th of July celebration at the fort, where he'd danced with her exactly twice and talked about railroad expansion for 40 minutes. Once at a dinner party hosted by the fort's quartermaster, where he described in detail his plans to purchase undeveloped territories for commercial development. And once, 2 weeks ago, when he'd arrived with a ring and her father's blessing and asked for her hand while looking at her father instead of her. She'd said yes because saying no had never been an option. Victor was 43 years old, wealthy beyond measure, connected to railroad companies, mining operations, cattle syndicates, territorial politicians. He wore expensive suits and smelled of cigars and hair tonic. When he smiled, it never reached his eyes. Her father called him a strategic alliance. Eleanor called him a stranger. In 3 days, she would promise to love, honor, and obey him for the rest of her life. Eleanor pressed her forehead against the window glass and closed her eyes. The afternoon heat was suffocating. Eleanor spent it doing the things expected of her. She reviewed the menu for the evening's dinner with Mrs. Kowalski, the fort's head cook. She sorted through linens with the housekeeper. She wrote letters to distant relatives she'd never met, announcing her upcoming marriage with words that felt hollow as drumheads. All the while, her mind kept returning to the parade ground, to the prisoner, to the way he'd knelt in the dust without breaking, without begging, without giving them anything at all. Who was he? What had he done, really done, to deserve execution? Her father said he was a scout involved in the Culver massacre, but her father had also once told her that the Apache were subhuman savages, incapable of civilization or mercy. And yet she'd seen this prisoner's eyes, seen the intelligence in them, the defiance, the humanity. By late afternoon, she couldn't stand it anymore. Eleanor told Mrs. Kowalski she had a headache and needed to rest before dinner. Then she slipped out the back entrance of the command house, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders despite the heat, and walked across the compound toward the stockade. Soldiers passed her with salutes and respectful nods. No one questioned where she was going. She was the colonel's daughter. She went where she pleased. The stockade sat in the shadow of the fort's western wall, a low stone structure with a heavy oak door and no windows. A private stood guard outside, a young man named Miller, who couldn't have been more than 19. He straightened when he saw Eleanor approaching. "Miss Whitmore?" He touched his cap. "Ma'am." Eleanor smiled, the practiced smile she'd perfected over years of being a colonel's daughter. "Good afternoon, Private Miller. Terribly hot today, isn't it?" "Yes, ma'am, sure is." "I imagine standing out here in the sun is rather unpleasant." Miller shifted his weight, uncertain where this was going. "It's not so bad, ma'am." Eleanor glanced toward the stockade door. "The prisoner, has he been given water?" Miller's expression closed immediately. "Colonel's orders, ma'am. No food, no water until further notice." "I see." Eleanor paused, as if considering. Then she looked back at Miller with wide, innocent eyes. "It's just that my father mentioned wanting the prisoner alive for questioning, and in this heat, without water, well, I wouldn't want him dying before the colonel has what he needs. That would reflect poorly on whoever was responsible for guarding him." She let the implication hang in the air. Miller paled. The colonel said, "I'm sure my father would make an exception for basic survival, Private. A man can't confess if he's dead from thirst, can he?" Eleanor kept her voice gentle, reasonable. "I could bring water, just a small amount, enough to keep him alive. That way, if anyone asks, you can say the colonel's daughter took responsibility for ensuring the prisoner survived for interrogation." Miller looked torn, his young face creased with uncertainty. Eleanor could almost see him weighing his orders against the possibility of punishment if the prisoner died on his watch. "I don't know, ma'am. I'll take full responsibility," Eleanor pressed. "If my father objects, I'll explain it was my decision entirely." Miller hesitated a moment longer, then slowly he nodded. If you're taking responsibility, ma'am." Eleanor smiled again. "Thank you, Private. I'll return shortly." She hurried back to the command house before he could change his mind. 20 minutes later, Eleanor returned with a tin cup filled with water and a small cloth bundle containing bread and dried meat. Miller had grown more nervous in her absence, his eyes darting toward the command house as if expecting the colonel to appear at any moment. "Just a few minutes, ma'am," he said as he unlocked the stockade door. "And I need to stay right here while you're inside." "Of course." The door swung open. Heat and darkness spilled out. Eleanor stepped inside, and Miller pulled the door mostly closed behind her, leaving just enough gap to let in a sliver of light. The stockade was barely larger than a closet. The stone walls radiated heat like an oven. The air was thick, almost solid with it. There was no furniture, no bucket, nothing except packed dirt and shadows. And in the corner, the prisoner. He sat with his back against the wall, his legs drawn up, his wrists still shackled together in front of him. His head rested against the stone, tilted back, his eyes closed. For a moment, Eleanor thought he might be unconscious or worse. Then his eyes opened. Black eyes, sharp and aware despite everything. Eleanor's breath caught. She'd seen him from a distance, from her window, but this was different. This close, she could see the details the distance had hidden. The hard angles of his face, all sharp cheekbones and strong jaw. The thin scar running through his left eyebrow. The way his chest rose and fell with careful, controlled breaths despite what must have been considerable pain. He watched her without speaking, without moving. Eleanor found her voice. "I brought water." No response, just that steady, unblinking stare. She took a step closer, then another. The space was so small there was nowhere to go, nowhere to maintain distance. She knelt in the dirt in front of him, acutely aware of how ridiculous she must look in her fine dress and lace collar, kneeling in filth to offer water to a chained prisoner. She held out the cup. He didn't take it. "Please," Eleanor said quietly. "You'll die without water." His voice, when it finally came, was rough from disuse and dehydration, but clear. "Why do you care?" The question struck her like a physical blow. Why did she care? She didn't know this man, didn't know his story, his crimes, his truth. For all she knew, her father was right. Maybe he was a killer, a raider, someone who deserved everything happening to him. But when she looked into his eyes, she didn't see a killer. She saw a man. "I don't know," she admitted. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or suspicion. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze moving from the cup to her face and back again. Then slowly, he leaned forward and took the cup in his shackled hands. He drank carefully, controlled, not gulping despite what must have been desperate thirst. When the cup was half empty, he stopped and lowered it, his eyes never leaving hers. "Thank you." 2 words, simple, but they carried weight Eleanor hadn't expected. She pulled the cloth bundle from her pocket and unwrapped it, revealing the bread and meat. "I brought food too. Not much, but why?" He cut her off, his voice sharper now. "Why are you doing this?" Eleanor sat back on her heels, the question hitting harder the second time. "I told you I don't know." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have." They stared at each other in the suffocating heat and dimness. Outside, she could hear Miller shifting nervously, could hear the distant sounds of the fort going about its business. But in here, in this tiny stone box, there was only silence and heat, and the steady gaze of a man who had every reason to hate her. "My name is Eleanor," she said finally. He said nothing. "What's yours?" Still nothing. But something changed in his expression, some subtle shift she couldn't quite read. "They're going to execute you on Sunday," Eleanor continued. 3 days, unless you give them what they want." "I know." "Then why not tell them? Why not—" "Because I have nothing to tell." His voice was flat, certain. "I'm not what they say I am." Eleanor's chest tightened. "Then what are you?" "It doesn't matter what I am." He looked down at the shackles on his wrists, at the iron that had rubbed his skin raw and bleeding. "It only matters what they believe." "But if you're innocent, innocent." He laughed, a bitter sound with no humor in it. "Your people don't care about innocence. They care about land, about railroads, about expansion. I'm just in the way." Eleanor wanted to argue, wanted to defend her father and the fort and the cause they all served. But the words wouldn't come, because somewhere deep in her chest, beneath years of training and propriety and unquestioning loyalty, a small voice whispered that he might be right. "What's your name?" she asked again. This time he answered, "Talon." The name hung in the air between them like a struck chord. "Talon," Eleanor repeated. "I'm sorry for what's happening to you." He studied her face for a long moment. "You should go before someone sees you here." "I'll come back, tonight if I can, with more water." "Don't." His voice was sharp. "Don't risk yourself for me. I'm already dead." "You're not dead yet." 3 days, he said. "Might as well be." Eleanor stood, her knees protesting, dirt staining her dress. She looked down at him one last time, at this man named Talon, who sat chained in darkness, waiting for an execution he claimed not to deserve. 3 days is still 3 days, she said. A lot can happen in 3 days. She turned and knocked on the door. Miller opened it immediately, his face anxious. Eleanor stepped out into the blinding afternoon sun, blinking against the sudden light. "Thank you, Private," she said. Miller locked the door behind her, his hands shaking slightly. Was he? He drank the water, Eleanor said. That's all. She walked away before he could ask anything else. Victor Harlan arrived at sunset in a black carriage pulled by matched bay horses, trailing dust and importance. Eleanor watched from her bedroom window as he descended from the carriage, straightening his coat and adjusting his hat before striding toward the command house with the confidence of a man who owned everything he touched. He was tall, well-dressed, his graying hair pomaded back from a face that might have been handsome if it weren't so hard around the eyes. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm and shook hands with Colonel Whitmore on the front steps, like they were old friends closing a business deal, which, Eleanor supposed, they were. She turned from the window and looked at herself in the vanity mirror. Mrs. Kowalski had helped her dress for dinner, a burgundy gown with a high collar and pearl buttons, her hair pinned up in an elaborate style that had taken an hour to arrange. She looked like someone else, someone refined and elegant and completely hollow. A knock on the door. "Eleanor?" Her father's voice. "Victor is here. We're waiting." Eleanor took a breath, smoothed her skirts, and opened the door. "What?" Dinner was excruciating. Victor dominated the conversation, discussing railroad expansion and territorial development with the enthusiasm of a man describing his favorite hobby. He talked about land acquisitions, about strategic parcels and undeveloped territories, and indigenous obstacles that needed to be cleared for progress. Eleanor sat across from him, eating mechanically, smiling when expected, nodding when appropriate. Her father watched her with approval. Victor barely looked at her at all, except when making occasional comments about their upcoming marriage, speaking about her as if she were another piece of property he was acquiring. "The ceremony will be small," Victor was saying, cutting his steak with precise movements. "Just family and essential business associates. We'll honeymoon in San Francisco. I have investments there that require attention. Then we'll return to my estate in Santa Fe. Eleanor will have everything she needs. A proper home, social standing, security." "It sounds wonderful," Colonel Whitmore said. Eleanor said nothing. Victor finally looked at her directly. "You've been quiet tonight, my dear. I hope you're not feeling unwell." "Just tired, Mr. Harlan." "Victor, please. We'll be married soon. Formality seems unnecessary." He smiled, showing teeth. "And you must call me by my given name. I insist." "Victor," Eleanor repeated. The name felt wrong in her mouth. The meal continued. More talk of business, of politics, of the territorial governor's recent policies. Eleanor felt herself drifting, her mind wandering back to the stockade, to Talon sitting in darkness, to the way he'd looked at her when she'd asked his name. "Don't you agree, Eleanor?" She blinked. Victor was looking at her expectantly. So was her father. "I'm sorry, I was saying that a woman's role is to support her husband's endeavors," Victor repeated, his smile thinning slightly. "To maintain the home and provide the stability that allows a man to focus on important work. Don't you agree?" Eleanor's fingers tightened on her fork. "I suppose that depends on the endeavor." Her father's eyes sharpened. Victor's smile vanished entirely. "I'm not sure I understand," Victor said carefully. Eleanor knew she should stop, should apologize, should smile, should be the obedient daughter and future wife everyone expected. But something in her chest had cracked open that afternoon in the stockade, and now she couldn't seem to close it again. "I only mean that supporting someone's work requires understanding what that work is," she said, keeping her voice level, "and believing in its purpose." "The purpose is progress," Victor said. His tone had cooled. "Civilization. Order. Surely you believe in those things." "Of course. I only wonder sometimes what the cost is." But silence fell over the table like a physical weight. Colonel Whitmore set down his wine glass with controlled precision. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "perhaps you should retire. You said you weren't feeling well." It was not a suggestion. Eleanor stood, her chair scraping against the floor. "Forgive me. I think the heat today affected me more than I realized. Good night, Father, Victor." She left the dining room before either man could respond, her heart pounding, her hand shaking again. She climbed the stairs to her room, closed the door, and leaned against it, trying to steady her breathing. What was happening to her? 3 days ago, she would never have questioned Victor or her father. 3 days ago, she would have sat through that dinner with a smile and perfect manners and never let a single rebellious thought cross her lips. But 3 days ago, she hadn't looked into Talon's eyes. Eleanor crossed to the window facing the stockade. The sun had set completely now, leaving only darkness and the scattered torches of the fort's perimeter. Somewhere out there, in that stone box, a man sat chained and waiting to die for crimes he said he didn't commit. A man who looked at her like she was a person, not a possession. She stood at the window until late into the night, long after she heard Victor's carriage leave, long after the fort grew quiet. Stood there and thought about innocence and guilt, about duty and conscience, about the difference between what was legal and what was right. And sometime after midnight, Eleanor Whitmore made a decision that would change everything. The fort slept. Eleanor waited until the command house was silent, until even her father's lamp went dark. Then she dressed in the plainest dress she owned, wrapped a dark shawl around her shoulders, and slipped out of her room like a shadow. The hallways were empty. Her footsteps whispered on the wooden floors. She descended the back stairs and let herself out through the kitchen entrance, easing the door closed with barely a sound. The night air was cooler but still carried the day's heat. The moon was a thin crescent, giving just enough light to see by. Eleanor kept to the shadows along the walls, moving quickly but carefully toward the stockade. A different guard stood watch now. Corporal Hayes, an older soldier with a weathered face and a tendency to doze on late shifts. Eleanor watched from the corner of the supply shed as Hayes leaned against the stockade wall, his rifle propped beside him, his head nodding forward. She waited. 5 minutes. 10. Hayes's breathing deepened. His head drooped. Eleanor moved. She crossed the open space to the stockade in seconds, her heart hammering. Hayes didn't stir. She knelt beside the door, pulled a thin metal nail file from her pocket, the only tool she'd been able to find, and worked it into the lock. She had no idea what she was doing, no idea if this would even work. But she'd watched soldiers lock and unlock this door a dozen times, had seen the simple mechanism, had convinced herself it couldn't be that complicated. The metal scraped, clicked. The lock turned. Eleanor froze, holding her breath. Hayes snorted, shifted, settled again. She eased the door open just enough to slip through, then pulled it shut behind her. "Talon?" she whispered into the darkness. Movement in the corner. "What are you doing here?" His voice was stronger than it had been this afternoon. The water had helped. Eleanor fumbled in her pocket and pulled out a small oil lamp she'd brought, already lit but shuttered. She opened the shutter just enough to cast a dim glow. Talon sat exactly where she'd left him, still shackled, but his eyes were alert and focused on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I brought more water," she said, holding up a canteen. "And food. And—" She stopped, suddenly unsure of herself. "I don't know. I couldn't leave you here." Talon stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "You shouldn't be here. If they catch you." "I know." Eleanor moved closer, kneeling in the dirt again. "But I keep thinking about what you said, about being innocent, about this all being about land and railroads. And I realized—" She stopped, the words hard to form. "I realized I needed to know the truth." "The truth?" Talon's laugh was harsh. "You want the truth? Your people are planning to steal Apache land for a railroad line. My village sits right in the path. They needed a reason to remove us, so they blamed us for a raid we didn't commit. I was hunting alone when they found me. They beat me, chained me, called me a murderer. In 3 days they'll hang me, and my people will be forced off their land with no one to speak for them. That's the truth." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. "How do you know this? About the railroad?" "Because I heard them talking. Your Colonel Whitmore and the man in the expensive suit. The one who arrived tonight." "Victor?" "I don't know his name, but I heard them. 2 days ago, before they moved me to this place. They were standing outside the holding cell, discussing timeline and acquisition and how my execution would help expedite the process. Those were the exact words. Eleanor's hands had started shaking again. That's not possible. My father wouldn't. Your father is a soldier following orders. The man in the suit is the one giving them. Victor Harlan, who talked about strategic parcels and indigenous obstacles. Victor, who would be her husband in 3 days. I don't believe you, Eleanor whispered. But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. She did believe him. That was the problem. Talon's expression softened slightly. You should go. Forget this. Marry your rich man, live your comfortable life. This isn't your fight, but it is. The words came out before Eleanor could stop them. It is my fight, because if what you're saying is true, then I'm part of it. My father is part of it. The man I'm supposed to marry is... She stopped, her throat tight. I can't just ignore this. What can you do? Talon's voice was gentle now, almost pitying. You're one woman. You have no power here. Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him, at the shackles on his wrists, at the bruises on his skin, at the dignity in his eyes despite everything. And she thought about Sunday, about a noose and a man who might be innocent dying because it was convenient for powerful men with profitable plans. Maybe I don't have power, she said, but I have access. I can find proof, documents, letters, something that shows what's really happening. And then what? Even with proof, who would believe you? I don't know, but I have to try. Talon studied her face in the lamplight. Why? Why does this matter to you? Eleanor didn't have an answer, or rather, she had too many answers, all jumbled together and impossible to separate. Because it was wrong. Because she was tired of being a piece in other people's games. Because when she looked at Talon, she saw something real in a world that suddenly felt constructed entirely of lies. Because someone has to care, she said finally. Talon was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. The documents would be in your father's office, probably locked. I can pick locks, apparently. Eleanor held up the nail file with a shaky smile. Talon almost smiled back. Almost. You're going to get yourself killed. Maybe, but at least I'll die knowing I tried. She stood, brushing dirt from her dress. I'll come back tomorrow night. If I find anything, I'll bring it. If not, she trailed off. If not, you forget this ever happened. No, Eleanor looked down at him. If not, I'll find another way. I promise. She turned toward the door, then stopped. Talon? Yes? Thank you for telling me the truth. Don't thank me yet. The truth might destroy everything you believe in. Eleanor opened the door a crack, checking that Hayes was still asleep. He was. She slipped out, locked the door behind her, and disappeared into the shadows. Behind her, in the darkness of the stockade, Talon sat with the canteen of water she'd left, and wondered if he'd just met the bravest person he'd ever known, or the most foolish. Probably both. Yet, Eleanor made it back to her room without being seen. She undressed in the dark, her hands still trembling, and climbed into bed. But sleep was impossible. She lay staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through everything Talon had said. A railroad through Apache land. A raid that didn't happen. An execution to expedite the process. If it was true, and every instinct Eleanor had screamed that it was, then her entire world was built on lies. Her father, who'd raised her to believe in duty and honor and the righteousness of their cause. Victor, who spoke of progress and civilization while planning to kill an innocent man for profit. And her, Eleanor Whitmore, who'd spent 22 years being exactly what everyone expected her to be. Never questioning, never challenging, never thinking about the cost of her comfort. Until now, Eleanor rolled onto her side and looked toward the window, toward the distant shape of the stockade barely visible in the darkness. 3 days until the execution. 3 days until her wedding. 3 days to find the truth and decide what to do with it. The eastern sky was just beginning to pale with approaching dawn when Eleanor finally fell into a fitful sleep, dreaming of mountains and chains and eyes like black glass that saw straight through her carefully constructed lies. Morning came too quickly, dragging Eleanor from restless dreams into harsh sunlight that felt like an accusation. She dressed mechanically, her fingers clumsy on the buttons of her day dress, her mind still caught in the web of last night's revelations. The face staring back from her vanity mirror looked pale, dark circles under her eyes that powder couldn't quite hide. Downstairs, her father was already at breakfast, the newspaper spread beside his plate like always. He glanced up when Eleanor entered, his gaze sharp and assessing. "You look tired." "I didn't sleep well," Eleanor said, which was true enough. "Victor mentioned you seemed distressed at dinner." The colonel folded his newspaper with precise creases. "He's concerned you might be having second thoughts about the marriage." Eleanor poured herself coffee with hands that wanted to shake, but she wouldn't let them. "I'm not having second thoughts. I'm just adjusting to the idea." "There's nothing to adjust to. You'll marry him on Sunday, you'll move to Santa Fe, and you'll fulfill the role expected of you. It's a good match, Eleanor. Better than you had any right to expect." He returned to his newspaper. "Victor is meeting with the territorial surveyor this morning. He'll return this afternoon with updated maps of the acquisition zones. I expect you to join us for tea at 4 o'clock. "Acquisition zones?" Her father's eyes lifted again, this time with a flicker of impatience. "The land parcels being developed for the railroad extension. Victor has been coordinating with the surveyor's office for months. Surely he's mentioned it." Eleanor's throat went dry. "He's mentioned the railroad, yes. It's quite an undertaking. Once complete, it will open up the entire southwestern territory for commerce and settlement. Decades of progress condensed into a few years of strategic development." Her father's voice carried the pride of a man describing a military campaign. "Victor's firm is handling the primary land acquisitions. Complicated work, but necessary. What happens to the people already living on that land?" The question came out before Eleanor could stop it. Her father set down his newspaper entirely now, his full attention fixed on her with an intensity that made her wish she could take the words back. "What people?" "The Apache. The tribes in the path of the railroad." Colonel Whitmore's expression hardened. "They'll be relocated to designated territories. It's already been negotiated with the tribal councils." "Have they agreed to it?" "Their agreement is irrelevant. This is American territory, Eleanor. The treaties are a formality, nothing more. If they resist, they'll be removed by force. That's how civilization advances." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Why this sudden interest in policy matters?" Eleanor forced herself to meet his gaze. "I was just curious. Victor speaks about it so often, I thought I should understand what he does." "Understanding isn't necessary. Support is." Her father picked up his newspaper again, the discussion clearly over. 4 o'clock. Don't be late." Eleanor nodded and escaped to the hallway, her pulse hammering in her ears. Acquisition zones, strategic development, removal by force. The words echoed in her mind like the crack of Sergeant Warren's whip, and beneath them Talon's voice. They needed a reason to remove us, so they blamed us for a raid we didn't commit. She had to find proof. Had to know for certain whether everything Talon said was true, or if she was throwing away her entire life on the word of a condemned prisoner she'd spoken to twice. Eleanor climbed the stairs to the second floor, but instead of turning toward her room, she continued down the hallway to the heavy oak door at the end. Her father's office. The room where he kept his files, his correspondence, his records of everything that happened at Fort Coyote Ridge. The door was locked, as she'd known it would be. Eleanor pulled the nail file from her pocket and studied the mechanism, her heart racing. It was more complex than the stockade lock, but not impossibly so. She worked the file into the keyhole, feeling for the tumblers, trying to remember the motion that had worked last night. "Miss Whitmore?" Eleanor spun around, shoving the nail file behind her back. "Mrs." Kowalski stood at the top of the stairs, a basket of linens in her arms, her round face creased with concern. "I was just—" Eleanor's mind raced. "I thought I heard something inside, like a mouse or something." Mrs. Kowalski frowned. "A mouse in the colonel's office? I just cleaned in there yesterday." "Perhaps I was mistaken." Eleanor stepped away from the door, her cheeks burning. "The heat, you know. It makes me hear things." The housekeeper's frown deepened. "You've been looking poorly these past few days, miss. Maybe you should lie down before tea this afternoon." Yes, I think I will." Eleanor fled to her room before Mrs. Kowalski could ask any more questions. She closed the door and leaned against it, her hands shaking now in earnest. That had been too close. If Mrs. Kowalski mentioned finding her at the colonel's door, if her father started asking questions, she needed a different approach, something less obvious, less risky. But what? Eleanor crossed to her window and looked out at the parade ground below. Soldiers moved through their morning drills, their boots raising dust in perfect formations. Beyond the fort walls, the desert stretched endlessly toward those distant mountains where Talon's people lived, where they waited to be displaced for the sake of progress and profit. A soft knock on her door made Eleanor jump. "Come in." The door opened and Private Miller stepped inside, cap in hand, his young face anxious. "Begging your pardon, Miss Whitmore, but the colonel sent me to fetch some documents from his office. He said you might have the key." Eleanor's pulse spiked. "The key?" "Yes, ma'am. He said he gave you a copy for emergencies in case something needed to be retrieved when he was occupied." Miller shifted his weight. "If you don't have it, I can go back and ask—" "No." Eleanor's mind raced. Her father had never given her a key to his office. But Miller didn't know that, and if she played this right— "Yes, I have it. What documents does he need?" Miller pulled a folded paper from his pocket and consulted it. The territorial survey maps and the most recent correspondence from the Harlan Group. He said they should be in the filing cabinet, left side, second drawer. The Harlan Group, Victor's company. Eleanor's hand steadied as purpose crystallized. "I'll get them for you." "Wait here." She hurried back down the hallway, pulled out the nail file, and this time worked the lock with focused determination. The mechanism clicked open. Eleanor pushed the door wide and stepped into her father's private domain. The office smelled of leather and tobacco. Heavy furniture dominated the space, a massive desk, filing cabinets along one wall, bookshelves stuffed with military manuals and territorial records. Everything was organized with military precision, every paper aligned, every book spine flush with the shelf edge. Eleanor went straight to the filing cabinet Miller had indicated. The second drawer was locked too, but this one opened easier, and inside she found exactly what Miller had described: rolled survey maps tied with string, and beneath them a thin folder labeled Harlan Group, Confidential Correspondence. Her hands trembled as she lifted the folder out. She should take only what Miller requested, should play it safe, should not risk taking anything her father would notice missing. Instead, she opened the folder and scanned the contents. Letters between her father and Victor, dated over the past 6 months. References to target acquisition zones and indigenous relocation schedules. A detailed timeline showing the planned railroad route cutting directly through what was labeled Apache Settlement, Priority Removal. And then, 3 pages down, a letter that made Eleanor's blood run cold. The header read, Strategic Incident Report, Culver Homestead. It was written in her father's precise handwriting, dated 2 weeks before the raid that had killed the Culver family. But the contents weren't a report of an attack. They were a plan for one. Botal. Necessary to establish casus belli for immediate tribal removal. The Culver homestead presents an ideal opportunity given its proximity to the target zone. Recommended action. Stage assault, consistent with Apache raid patterns. Ensure casualties sufficient to justify military response. Plant evidence linking attack to the Red Creek Band. Timing critical. Must occur before territorial survey completion. Eleanor's vision blurred. She read it again, certain she must be misunderstanding, but the words didn't change. Her father hadn't reported the Culver massacre. He'd planned it, ordered it, murdered 3 people, 2 of them children, to create an excuse for removing Talon's people from their land. "Miss Whitmore?" Miller's voice floated up from downstairs. Eleanor's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the papers. She forced herself to breathe, to think. She couldn't take this file. Her father would notice immediately. But she needed proof. Needed something to show what was really happening. Her eyes fell on the desk, where her father's personal stationery sat in a neat stack. Without letting herself think about it, Eleanor grabbed several sheets and a pen, then copied the most damning sections of the letter in handwriting she tried to make as different from her own as possible. Her script came out cramped and messy, but the words were there, the evidence preserved. She folded the copied pages and shoved them deep into her pocket, replaced the file exactly as she'd found it, grabbed the survey maps Miller had actually been sent for, and hurried out of the office. The lock clicked shut behind her. "Here!" Eleanor thrust the maps at Miller when she reached her room. "These are what the colonel needs. I didn't see any other correspondence in that drawer." Miller took the maps, looking relieved. Thank you, ma'am. The colonel will be pleased. He left, and Eleanor closed her door again, this time locking it from the inside. She pulled the copied pages from her pocket and read them again in the sunlight streaming through her window. The words were still there, still damning, still true. Her father was a murderer. Victor was his accomplice. And Talon was going to die for crimes her father had committed. Eleanor sank onto her bed, the papers clutched in her hands, and tried to process the magnitude of what she'd discovered. Everything she'd believed about her life, her father, her place in the world, all of it built on a foundation of lies and blood. What was she supposed to do now? The answer came to her with brutal clarity. She had to get Talon out, had to expose what her father and Victor were doing, had to stop the execution and the land theft and all of it, even if it meant destroying everything she'd ever known. But how? She was one woman with no power, no authority, no allies. Who would believe her even with the evidence? And even if they did, would it matter? Her father was a decorated colonel. Victor was one of the wealthiest men in the territory. She was just a colonel's daughter with a piece of paper and a condemned man's word. Eleanor looked at the clock on her mantel. 11 in the morning. 5 hours until tea with Victor and her father. 2 days until the execution. 2 days to figure out how to save an innocent man and stop a conspiracy that reached from Fort Coyote Ridge all the way to the territorial governor's office. She folded the papers carefully and hid them in the lining of her jewelry box, beneath the false bottom where she kept her mother's locket. Then she changed into riding clothes and went to find the one person at the fort who might be willing to help her. Lieutenant James Garrett was the youngest officer at Fort Coyote Ridge, barely 25, fresh from West Point with ideals still intact and cynicism not yet set in. He was also the only officer Eleanor had ever heard question an order, even just once, even just quietly. She found him in the stables, checking his horse's shoes with the careful attention he gave everything. He looked up when Eleanor approached, surprise crossing his sun-browned face. "Miss Whitmore, I didn't expect to see you here." "I need to ask you something, Lieutenant, something confidential." Garrett straightened, his expression shifting to cautious attention. "I'm not sure that's appropriate, ma'am. Perhaps you should speak with your father." "I can't speak with my father about this." Eleanor glanced around, making sure they were alone. The stable hand was at the far end of the building, out of earshot. "Please, just listen." Garrett hesitated, then nodded. "Go ahead." "The Apache prisoner in the stockade. What do you know about him?" Whatever Garrett had been expecting, it wasn't that. His eyebrows rose. "The scout. Only what everyone knows. He was captured during a raid on the Culver homestead. He's set to hang on Sunday." "Do you believe he's guilty?" "It's not my place to believe or disbelieve, Miss Whitmore. The evidence—" "What evidence?" Eleanor pressed. "Have you seen any actual proof that he was at the Culver place? Any witnesses? Anything beyond Sergeant Warren's word?" Garrett's jaw tightened. "Miss Whitmore, I don't understand what you're asking me." Eleanor made a decision. She pulled the copied pages from her pocket and handed them to Garrett. "Read this." He unfolded the papers, his eyes scanning the words. Eleanor watched the color drain from his face as he read. When he finished, he looked up at her with something close to horror in his eyes. "Where did you get this?" "My father's office. It's a copy of a letter he wrote to Victor Harlan. Lieutenant, they planned the Culver massacre. They killed those people to justify removing the Apache from land they want for the railroad. The prisoner, Talon, he's innocent. They're executing him to cover their tracks." Garrett stared at the papers, then at Eleanor, then back at the papers. His hands were shaking. "This can't be real. Colonel Whitmore would never—" "Read it again. Look at the handwriting, the details, the timeline. It's real, Lieutenant. My father is planning to murder an innocent man 2 days from now, and unless someone stops him—" Her voice broke. "Please, I need help. I can't do this alone." Garrett folded the papers carefully, his face ashen. "If this is real, if what you're saying is true, this goes beyond the fort, beyond the territory even. This is conspiracy at the highest levels. The territorial governor must be involved, the railroad companies, the surveying office. I know. That's why I came to you. You're the only officer here who I've ever seen question anything, even once. The only one who might care more about what's right than what's convenient." "I could be court-martialed just for having this conversation," Garrett said quietly. "If the colonel found out—" "He won't find out. Not unless you tell him." They stood in silence for a long moment, dust motes drifting through the shafts of sunlight streaming between the stable boards. Somewhere outside, soldiers shouted commands. A horse whinnied, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary day at Fort Coyote Ridge, where nothing was ordinary anymore. "What do you want me to do?" Garrett asked finally. Eleanor felt something like hope kindle in her chest. "I don't know yet, but I need someone I can trust, someone who knows the fort, knows the protocols. If I'm going to get Talon out before Sunday—" "Get him out?" Garrett's eyes widened. "Miss Whitmore, you're talking about breaking a prisoner out of military custody. That's not just court-martial territory, that's treason. So is murdering civilians and framing innocent men." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I know what I'm asking. I know the risks. But I can't stand by and let this happen. I won't." Garrett ran a hand through his hair, his face torn between duty and conscience. "I need time to think. I need to think. You have until tonight. After that, I'm doing this with or without your help." Eleanor turned to leave, then stopped. "Lieutenant, one more thing. If you decide to report this conversation to my father, please give me enough warning to run. I'd rather be court-martialed in person than hanged in my sleep." She left before he could respond, walking back across the parade ground with her head high and her heart hammering. She'd either just found an ally or sealed her own fate. There was no way to know which until tonight. The sun climbed higher, the heat building like pressure before a storm. Eleanor went through the motions of the day like an actress in a play, smiling when expected, speaking when spoken to, all while her mind raced through possibilities and plans that seemed more desperate with each passing hour. At 4 o'clock, she presented herself in the parlor for tea. Victor was already there, seated in the best chair with survey maps spread across the side table. Her father stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, looking every inch the commanding officer. They both turned when Eleanor entered. "There she is." Victor rose, crossing to take her hand and kiss it. His lips were dry against her skin. "You look lovely, my dear. Much better than last night." "Thank you." Eleanor extracted her hand as quickly as politeness allowed and sat in the chair farthest from both men. Her father poured tea, the domestic gesture strange coming from hands that had written orders for murder. "Victor has brought the updated survey maps. The final acquisition zones are marked. Everything is progressing exactly on schedule." "Excellent timing," Victor said, accepting his teacup. "The execution on Sunday will provide the perfect capstone. Once the scout hangs, we can move forward with the removal orders. The tribal councils won't have a leg to stand on. We'll have clear evidence of Apache aggression, clear justification for relocation. By autumn, this entire corridor will be cleared and ready for track laying." Eleanor's hands tightened on her cup. "And the Apache families? Where will they go?" Victor waved a dismissive hand. "There's a reservation being established north of the Canadian River. Adequate land, government support. They'll be fine." "Will they?" Eleanor kept her voice carefully neutral. "I've heard conditions on reservations are quite harsh." "They're savages, Eleanor." Victor's tone held the patience of a teacher explaining something obvious to a slow student. "Harsh is relative. They've lived in primitive conditions for centuries. A reservation is an improvement. By whose measure?" The question came out sharper than Eleanor intended. Both men looked at her with varying degrees of surprise and disapproval. "By the measure of civilization," her father said firmly. "Eleanor, this conversation is inappropriate. These matters don't concern you. They concern my future husband's business. Shouldn't I understand what that business is?" "Understanding and questioning are different things." The colonel's voice carried a warning edge. "Your role is to support Victor's endeavors, not interrogate them." Eleanor set down her teacup with deliberate care. "And if his endeavors involve displacing hundreds of people from their homes, if they involve—" She stopped, catching herself before she said too much. Victor studied her with cold calculation in his eyes. "If they involve what, Eleanor?" "Nothing. Forgive me, I'm not feeling well again." "You haven't been feeling well since I arrived," Victor observed. "Perhaps you should see the fort doctor. I wouldn't want my bride collapsing at the altar on Sunday." The word Sunday hung in the air like smoke. Sunday, when Talon would hang. Sunday, when Eleanor would marry Victor. Sunday, when everything would be settled and sealed and irreversible. "I think I'll lie down before dinner," Eleanor said, standing. Please excuse me. She left the parlor feeling their eyes on her back like gun sights. In the hallway, she pressed herself against the wall and tried to steady her breathing. She'd pushed too hard, shown too much interest, asked too many questions. If her father started suspecting anything— Miss Whitmore? Eleanor nearly jumped out of her skin. Lieutenant Garrett stood at the end of the hallway, his uniform hat tucked under his arm, his expression grave. I need to speak with you, he said quietly. Privately. They walked to the far end of the fort, to an equipment shed that was rarely used. Inside, surrounded by spare wagon wheels and coiled rope, Garrett turned to face her. I've been thinking about what you showed me, about the letter, the accusations. He paused, choosing words carefully. I want to help, but we need to be smart about this. If we move too quickly, too obviously, we'll both end up in chains next to your Apache friend. Eleanor felt that fragile hope strengthen. What do you suggest? The guard rotation on the stockade changes at midnight. For about 15 minutes during the changeover, there's a gap in coverage while the night watch sergeant does his rounds. If someone were to intervene during that window, they might have enough time to get the prisoner out before anyone noticed. And then what? Where would we take him? There's a ravine about 3 miles northeast of the fort. Canyon Seco, the locals call it. Deep enough to hide in, remote enough that search parties might miss it on the first sweep. If your Apache knows the territory from there, he might be able to reach his people before the soldiers catch up. Eleanor's mind raced. What about supplies? He'll need water, food, something to travel with. I can handle that. I'll cache supplies in the ravine this afternoon during my patrol. Water, rations, a knife, basic survival gear. Garrett's jaw tightened. But Miss Whitmore, you understand what this means. If we're caught, it's not just our careers. It's our lives. Your father won't hesitate to— I know what my father will do. Eleanor met his eyes. I'm willing to risk it. Are you? Garrett was quiet for a moment, then he nodded. Yeah, I am. I didn't join the army to murder civilians and frame innocent men. If this is what it takes to sleep at night, then this is what I'll do. Thank you, Lieutenant. Don't thank me yet. We still have to pull this off. He glanced toward the door. You should get back before someone notices you're gone. Tonight, midnight. Be ready. Eleanor returned to the command house, her heart pounding with equal parts terror and determination. In her room, she changed into the darkest, most practical clothes she owned. Not riding clothes, too bulky. Not her fine dresses, too impractical. She settled on a simple work dress in dark gray, sturdy boots, and a shawl that could double as a blanket. Then she waited. Dinner was torture. Eleanor forced herself to eat, to smile, to make small talk with her father about nothing of consequence. Victor had returned to town but would be back Sunday morning for the wedding. The execution was scheduled for noon, the ceremony for 2 o'clock. Everything coordinated, everything planned, everything about to be destroyed if Eleanor succeeded tonight. At 10 o'clock, she excused herself and went to her room. She didn't undress, just lay on top of the covers in her dark clothes, watching the clock tick toward midnight with agonizing slowness. At 11:30, she heard her father's footsteps in the hallway, heard his door close. 15 minutes later, the house fell silent. Eleanor rose and crossed to her window. The fort below was quiet, most of the soldiers bedded down for the night. She could just make out the stockade, a dark rectangle against the darker ground, and the figure of the guard making his rounds. 11:50. Eleanor pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders and eased her door open. The hallway was dark, silent. She moved like a ghost through her father's house, down the stairs, out the back entrance into the cool night air. The parade ground seemed vast and exposed under the thin moon. Every shadow could hide a sentry, every sound could be discovery. Eleanor kept to the darkness along the walls, her heart hammering so hard she was sure anyone nearby would hear it. The stockade loomed ahead. The guard, Corporal Hayes again, was making his way toward the sergeant's station for the shift change. Eleanor pressed herself flat against the wall and waited. Midnight struck on the fort's clock tower. Hayes disappeared around the corner. The parade ground was empty. Eleanor ran. She reached the stockade door, pulled out the nail file that was becoming almost familiar in her hand, and worked the lock. It seemed to take forever, seemed to make enough noise to wake the dead. But finally, it clicked open. She pushed inside. Talon? Eleanor? His voice came from the darkness, surprised and urgent. What are you doing? Getting you out. We don't have much time. She knelt beside him, her hands finding the shackles in the dark. There's a lieutenant helping us. He's cached supplies in a ravine northeast of here, 3 miles. Can you make it? Can I? Yes, but Eleanor, if they catch you, they won't. She worked the nail file into the shackle lock, her hands shaking. I found proof of what they did. The Culver massacre, the land scheme, all of it. My father planned it, ordered it. You were telling the truth about everything. The lock clicked open. Talon's hands were free. You shouldn't have come, he said, but he was already standing, already moving toward the door. This is suicide. Maybe, but it's also the right thing to do. They reached the door. Eleanor eased it open, checking the parade ground. Still clear. She grabbed Talon's hand. His skin was rough and warm against hers, and pulled him out into the night. They ran together across the open ground, every second expecting shouts, gunshots, discovery. But the fort slept on, unaware that its carefully constructed lies were unraveling. They reached the wall. Eleanor led Talon to a service gate used for supply wagons, a small door that was usually locked but that Lieutenant Garrett had promised to leave open. It swung wide at her touch. Beyond the wall, the desert stretched endlessly under the stars. Freedom, danger, possibility. Talon looked back at the fort, then at Eleanor. Come with me. What? Come with me. You can't stay here now. When they find me gone, they'll know you helped. Your father will... He stopped, his jaw tight. Come with me, please. Eleanor looked back at the fort, at the command house where her father slept, at the life she'd known for 22 years. Then she looked at Talon, at this man who'd been willing to die rather than lie, at the possibility of something real in a world built on deception. She took his hand. Let's go. They ran into the darkness together, leaving Fort Coyote Ridge behind, leaving everything Eleanor had ever known, running toward the distant ravine and an uncertain future and the terrifying, exhilarating freedom of choosing her own path. Behind them, the fort slept on. But dawn was coming, and with it, the discovery that would turn Eleanor Whitmore from a colonel's daughter into a fugitive, from an obedient bride into a traitor. She didn't look back. The desert floor was treacherous in darkness, all hidden stones and sudden drops that threatened to turn an ankle or send them sprawling. Eleanor stumbled twice in the first 100 yards, her fine boots never meant for running across open country. Each time, Talon's hand steadied her, his grip strong and sure, despite the weeks of captivity that should have left him weak. They didn't speak. Speaking meant wasting breath they couldn't spare, meant making noise that could carry back to the fort. Eleanor focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on keeping pace with Talon's longer stride, on not thinking about what she'd just done or what would happen when the sun rose and her father discovered her gone. The land sloped gradually upward, rising toward the foothills that crouched between the desert floor and the distant mountains. Scrub brush caught at Eleanor's skirts. Rocks pressed through the thin soles of her boots. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she kept moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant terror. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Talon slowed and then stopped entirely, his head turning to scan the darkness behind them. Eleanor bent double, gasping for air, her heart slamming against her ribs. "Do you see anything?" she managed to whisper. "Not yet, but they'll notice soon." Talon's voice was rough but controlled. "The guard change won't last forever. Once they find the stockade empty, they'll sound the alarm." "How long do we have?" "Maybe an hour, maybe less." He looked northeast toward where the ravine should be. "Can you keep going?" Eleanor straightened, pressing a hand to the stitch in her side. "I don't have much choice, do I?" Something that might have been respect flickered across Talon's face. "No, you don't." They started moving again, slower now, but steadier. The landscape grew rougher as they climbed, the gentle slope giving way to broken terrain cut through with dry washes and rocky outcrops. The moon provided just enough light to navigate by, turning the world into shades of silver and black. Eleanor's mind raced as her body moved on autopilot. What had she done? She'd freed a prisoner, stolen military documents, betrayed her father, abandoned her wedding. In the span of 48 hours, she'd gone from dutiful daughter to wanted fugitive. If they were caught, her father wouldn't hesitate to make an example of her. Treason, they'd call it, aiding the enemy. The punishment would be severe, public, designed to discourage anyone else from following her path. And yet, even knowing all that, Eleanor couldn't make herself regret it. She thought of the letter she'd copied, of her father's precise handwriting describing the Culver massacre like a military operation. Ensure casualties sufficient to justify military response. Those words haunted her. 3 people dead, 2 of them children, all because it was convenient for Victor's railroad and her father's advancement. There, Talon said, breaking into her thoughts. Eleanor looked up. Ahead, the ground seemed to simply end, dropping away into darkness. As they got closer, she could make out the edges of a ravine cutting deep into the earth, its walls steep and rocky. They scrambled down the slope, loose stones sliding beneath their feet. The ravine was perhaps 30 feet deep and narrow enough that Eleanor could have touched both walls if she stretched out her arms. At the bottom, sheltered beneath an overhang, they found Lieutenant Garrett's cache: 2 canteens of water, a cloth sack containing hardtack, dried meat, and what looked like cornmeal, a hunting knife in a leather sheath, a thin wool blanket, basic supplies but better than nothing. Talon uncapped one of the canteens and drank deeply, water running down his chin. He offered it to Eleanor, who took it with shaking hands. The water was warm and tasted faintly of metal, but it was the most wonderful thing she'd ever tasted. "Your friend kept his word," Talon said, examining the knife. "This is good steel." "He's a good man." Eleanor sank down onto a boulder, her legs suddenly refusing to hold her. One of the few left at that fort, apparently. Talon crouched beside the supplies, his movements economical and purposeful. "You should go back." Eleanor's head snapped up. "What?" "Go back to the fort. Tell them I overpowered you, threatened you, forced you to help me escape. They'll believe it. You're the colonel's daughter. They'll believe you were a victim. I'm not going back." "Eleanor, I'm not going back," she repeated, her voice harder now. "Do you understand what I found in my father's office? Do you know what he did? I know he's willing to kill to get what he wants. That's why you need to go back before he ordered the Culver massacre." The words burst out of Eleanor like something that had been building pressure for too long. "He planned it, documented it, coordinated it like a military operation. Those people died because my father needed a reason to justify removing your people. And Victor," her voice broke, "the man I was supposed to marry in 2 days helped plan the whole thing. The railroad, the land theft, the execution, all of it." Talon had gone very still. "You're certain?" "I copied the letter myself. It's in my jewelry box back at the fort, hidden where my father won't think to look. But even without it, I know. I know what they are, what they've done." Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the residual desert heat. "I can't go back to that. I can't marry Victor, can't smile and pretend and be the dutiful daughter to a murderer. Even if they'd believe I was forced to help you, which they won't, I can't go back." Talon studied her in the moonlight, his dark eyes searching her face for something. "You gave up everything, your home, your family, your future?" "I gave up a lie." Eleanor met his gaze. "Everything I had was built on blood and deception. What kind of future is that?" "An easy one." "I don't want easy. I want to be able to look at myself in the mirror without feeling sick." She stood, her exhaustion giving way to something fiercer. "You asked me in the stockade why I cared. This is why. Because someone has to. Because those people at Culver deserved better. Because you deserve better. Because if I don't stand against this, then I'm part of it, and I won't be part of it anymore." Silence stretched between them, filled only with the small sounds of the night desert, the scuttle of some creature in the rocks, the whisper of wind through the ravine, the distant call of a hunting owl. "All right, Talon said finally. "Then you come with me. But you need to understand what that means. The soldiers will hunt us. Your father will send every man he has. We'll be sleeping on rocks, drinking from streams, eating whatever we can find or kill. There won't be soft beds or proper meals or any of the comforts you're used to." "Good," Eleanor said. "I'm tired of comfort." Talon almost smiled. Almost. "You're either the bravest person I've ever met or the most foolish. Can't I be both?" This time he did smile, quick and genuine, and it transformed his face completely. For just a moment, he wasn't a prisoner or a condemned man or a representative of his people. He was just Talon, young and alive and free. Then the smile faded and he was all business again. We need to move. Dawn's maybe 3 hours away. Once the sun rises, they'll track us easily in this terrain. We need to get to rougher ground, somewhere we can hide our trail. Where? The Sangre de Cristo foothills. If we can reach the pine forest before full light, we'll have a chance. The trees will hide us, confuse the trackers. He started repacking the supplies with quick efficiency. My village is another 2 days beyond that, maybe 3 given the terrain. If we can reach them. A sound cut through the night, distant but unmistakable. The fort's alarm bell ringing out in rapid, urgent peals that echoed across the desert. Eleanor's blood went cold. They know. Move. Talon grabbed the supply sack and one canteen, thrust the other canteen in the blanket at Eleanor. Now! They scrambled up the far side of the ravine, hauling themselves over rocks and through brush that tore at their clothes and skin. The alarm bell kept ringing, each peal like a countdown to their capture. Eleanor's heart hammered in time with it, her breath coming in ragged gasps as they reached the top and started running again. The land tilted upward more steeply now, forcing them to slow their pace. Eleanor's thighs burned, her lungs screamed, but terror drove her forward. Behind them, she could hear new sounds, distant shouts, the thunder of hooves. The hunt had begun. How many men will they send? Eleanor gasped. All of them. Talon pulled her down behind a cluster of boulders as torchlights appeared in the distance, spreading out from the fort like fireflies. Your father won't take chances. He'll send every available soldier, every tracker. They'll split into search parties, cover every direction. Then how do we? We stay ahead of them, stay smart, and we pray they make mistakes. Talon's jaw was set, his eyes calculating as he watched the torches spread. They'll expect us to head north toward my people's territory. That's the obvious route. So we go east first, toward the mountains, then circle back. Longer, harder, but less expected. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. The reality of their situation was sinking in with crushing weight. They were 2 people on foot, poorly supplied, being hunted by trained soldiers on horseback. The odds were impossible, but impossible was better than surrender. They moved again, angling east toward the dark bulk of the mountains. The terrain grew increasingly hostile. Steep slopes, loose scree that slid treacherously underfoot, deadfalls of sun-bleached wood that had to be climbed over or circled around. Every step was a battle. Every minute felt like borrowed time. The eastern sky was just beginning to pale when they reached the first real trees, scraggly pines clinging to the mountainside. Talon led Eleanor deep into their shadows, finally allowing them to stop in a small clearing ringed by boulders. We rest here, he said, his breathing heavy despite his apparent stamina. Just for a few minutes. Drink water, catch your breath. Eleanor collapsed onto a fallen log, her entire body shaking with exhaustion. Her feet felt like they were on fire inside her boots. Her hands were scraped bloody from catching herself during falls. Her fine dress was torn and filthy, completely ruined. She'd never been happier in her life. Here, Talon handed her a piece of dried meat. Eat. You'll need your strength. The meat was tough and salty and tasted like leather, but Eleanor chewed it mechanically, forcing her body to take the fuel it needed. Talon sat across from her on a boulder, chewing his own portion, his eyes never still as he scanned their surroundings. Tell me about your village, Eleanor said. Your people. Talon glanced at her, surprise flickering across his face. Why? Because I want to know. Because I'm risking my life to help you reach them, and I'd like to know what I'm risking it for. He was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor thought he might refuse. Then he spoke, his voice softer than she'd heard it before. We're called the Red Creek Band. About 60 people, families, elders, children. We've lived in the canyon country north of here for longer than anyone can remember. Good water, good hunting, protected from the worst weather. He paused, his expression distant. My mother makes baskets that are so fine they can hold water. My sister can track anything that moves on 4 legs. My uncle tells stories that make children forget to breathe. It sounds beautiful. It is. Or it was. His jaw tightened. before your government decided our land was worth taking. It's not my government anymore, Eleanor said quietly. Talon looked at her, really looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. No, I suppose it isn't. Dawn was breaking in earnest now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Beautiful and dangerous, the light would make them visible, would make tracking them easier. We need to move, Talon said, standing. Stay close to me. Step where I step. Touch as little as possible. The soldiers will have trackers, possibly Apache scouts they've forced into service. We need to leave as little trail as possible. They climbed higher into the mountains, the trees growing thicker, the air cooler and thinner. Talon moved with a grace that Eleanor envied, his feet finding purchase where she saw only loose stone, his body flowing around obstacles that she had to struggle past. He was patient with her, though, pausing when she needed to catch her breath, steadying her when the slope grew too steep, never showing frustration at her slower pace. By mid-morning, they'd gained enough elevation that Eleanor could look back and see the desert spreading out below them, the fort just visible as a dark square against the pale earth. From this height, it looked small and insignificant. Hard to believe something so small had controlled her entire life until 2 days ago. Look, Talon pointed down the mountain. Eleanor followed his gesture and felt her stomach drop. Riders, at least a dozen of them, spread out in a search line, moving methodically up the slope they'd climbed hours earlier. How far behind us? Eleanor whispered. 2, maybe 3 hours, but they're on horseback and we're on foot. That gap will close. Talon studied the terrain ahead, his brow furrowed. There's a creek about a mile ahead. If we can reach it, we can walk in the water, harder to track. They pushed on, urgency lending Eleanor strength she didn't know she had. The trees grew denser, blocking out the sun in patches, and the ground became carpeted with pine needles that muffled their footsteps. Every sound seemed amplified. The crack of a branch, the skitter of a disturbed stone, their own labored breathing. The creek, when they reached it, was barely more than a trickle, just enough water flowing over smooth stones to wet their boots. But it was moving, and that's what mattered. Talon led Eleanor downstream, both of them walking in the shallow water, letting the current erase their footprints. How long do we stay in the creek? Eleanor asked. As long as we can, until it gets too deep or too fast, or until we find a good place to exit where the rocks will hide our trail. Talon's eyes never stopped moving, always scanning, always alert. The trackers will follow us to the creek, but then they'll have to split up, some going upstream, some down. It buys us time. They walked in the water for what felt like miles, the cold seeping through Eleanor's boots and numbing her feet. Her legs ached from the constant effort of maintaining balance on slippery stones. Several times she lost her footing and had to grab Talon's arm to keep from falling. He never complained, just steadied her and kept moving. The sun climbed higher, turning the forest into a patchwork of light and shadow. Birds called from the branches above. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk screamed. Normal sounds of a normal day, except nothing about this was normal. There, Talon said, pointing to where the creek bed widened and a shelf of flat rock extended from the bank. We exit here. Step only on the rock. Don't leave any marks in the mud. They climbed out carefully, moving from stone to stone until they were well away from the creek. Talon led them through a maze of boulders and fallen trees, choosing their path with deliberate care, always favoring hard surfaces over soft earth. Finally, he found what he was looking for, a small cave, really just a deep overhang in a rock face, hidden behind a curtain of pine branches. They squeezed inside, and Talon arranged the branches to conceal the entrance. Inside, the cave was dim and cool, smelling of stone and earth, just barely large enough for both of them to sit with their backs against the wall. Eleanor sank down with a groan of relief, her body screaming its protest at every movement. "We'll wait here until dark," Talon said, settling beside her. "Let them pass us by. Then we move again. And if they find us? They won't. But if they do..." Talon pulled out the hunting knife, tested its edge with his thumb. "Then I make sure you have time to run. I'm not running without you." "Eleanor," I said, "I'm not running without you." She met his eyes in the dim light. "We're in this together now. Whatever happens." Talon stared at her for a long moment, and Eleanor saw something in his expression she couldn't quite name. Respect, maybe. Or something deeper, something that made her breath catch despite her exhaustion. "You're stubborn," he said finally. "I've been told that before. It's going to get you killed." "Maybe, but at least I'll die making my own choices." Talon shook his head, but there was the ghost of a smile on his lips. "Rest while you can. I'll keep watch." Eleanor wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could take a turn, but her body had other ideas. The moment she closed her eyes, sleep pulled her under like a riptide. She woke to Talon's hand over her mouth and his urgent whisper in her ear. "Don't move. Don't make a sound." Eleanor's eyes flew open. Through the pine branches concealing their cave, she could see shapes moving in the forest. Soldiers, dismounted now, spreading out to search on foot. She could hear their voices, calling to each other as they checked behind trees and under deadfalls. "Tracks ended at the creek, sir. Could be upstream or down." "Split up. Half go north, half south. I want every inch of this stream bed searched. They can't have gotten far." That voice. Eleanor's blood froze. Sergeant Warren, his gravelly tone unmistakable even at this distance. "What about the colonel's daughter, sir? Orders were to bring her back unharmed." The colonel's orders were to retrieve the prisoner and return his daughter to the fort. He didn't specify the condition she needed to be in. Warren's voice hardened. "The Apache is to be taken alive if possible, dead if necessary. Miss Whitmore will be returned regardless. She made her choice when she betrayed her father." Eleanor felt Talon tense beside her. His hand tightened on the knife handle. The soldiers were maybe 50 yards away, close enough that Eleanor could see their faces through the gaps in the branches. One of them was Private Miller, the young guard she'd convinced to let her see Talon that first day. He looked pale and sick, his rifle held awkwardly as he searched through the underbrush. "Keep moving," Warren barked. "They're on foot and we're mounted. We'll run them down before nightfall." The soldiers moved on, their voices fading as they spread out along the creek. Eleanor counted to 100 before she let herself breathe normally again. "That was too close," she whispered. "It's going to get closer." Talon released her and shifted to peer through the branches. "They're not giving up. They'll search all day, all night if they have to." "Then what do we do?" "We wait until full dark, then we move fast and we move quiet. No more following obvious paths, no more trying to hide our trail. We just run and hope we're faster than they are." Eleanor nodded, though dread sat heavy in her stomach. They were running out of time, running out of options. Eventually the soldiers would get lucky, or Eleanor and Talon would make a mistake, and this desperate flight would be over. But not yet. Not today. They waited in the cave as the sun crawled across the sky. Eleanor dozed fitfully, waking every time a sound penetrated the silence. The snap of a branch, the call of a bird, the distant whinny of a horse. Each time, Talon was there, alert and watchful, the knife never far from his hand. As twilight deepened into true darkness, Talon finally moved. "Time to go." They emerged from the cave into a world transformed by night. The forest was all shadows and whispers, every tree a potential hiding place for soldiers, every sound a potential alarm. But the darkness also concealed them, made them ghosts moving through a ghost world. Talon led them higher into the mountains, away from the creek, following a path only he could see. The grade grew steeper, the footing more treacherous. Eleanor's legs trembled with exhaustion, but she forced them to keep moving, one step and then another, falling into a rhythm that was more instinct than thought. Hours passed. The moon rose, thin and cold. Somewhere behind them, Eleanor thought she heard voices, but it might have been the wind. They were climbing a particularly steep section, Eleanor's hands raw from grabbing rocks and branches for support, when Talon suddenly stopped. Eleanor nearly ran into him. "What?" He held up a hand for silence. Then Eleanor heard it too. Voices. Close. Too close. "This way. I saw something move." Talon grabbed Eleanor's hand and pulled her off the trail into a dense thicket of scrub oak. They crawled on their bellies, branches tearing at their clothes and skin, until they were deep in the undergrowth. Then they froze. Two soldiers emerged onto the trail they'd just left, torches held high, rifles at the ready. In the firelight, Eleanor recognized one of them, Corporal Hayes, who'd been guarding the stockade that first night. "You sure you saw something?" Hayes asked his companion. Thought I did. Could have been a deer. Could have been the fugitives. Hayes swept his torch in an arc, the light barely penetrating the thicket where Eleanor and Talon hid. The sergeant says the colonel wants them found tonight. Says he won't tolerate his daughter embarrassing him like this. What do you think will happen to her? If we catch them, I mean. Hayes spat into the dirt. Nothing good. The colonel looked ready to kill someone when he found her room empty. Never seen him that angry. The soldiers moved on, their voices fading, but Eleanor couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her father's rage, his humiliation. She'd known he'd be angry, but hearing it described secondhand made it real in a way it hadn't been before. We need to keep moving, Talon whispered. They crawled out of the thicket and resumed their climb, but something had changed in Eleanor. The last threads of doubt had burned away, leaving only certainty. There was no going back. Even if she wanted to, even if she tried to return and beg forgiveness, her father would never forgive this betrayal. She'd chosen her path, and now she had to see it through to the end, whatever that end might be. The mountains grew taller around them, the trees thicker, the air colder. Eleanor's breath misted in the darkness. Her dress, torn and filthy, provided little warmth. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and kept climbing. Dawn found them high in the foothills, the fort lost to distance and intervening ridges. They'd outrun the immediate pursuit, but Eleanor knew it was only temporary. The soldiers would regroup, spread out, keep searching. They had resources, supplies, fresh horses. Eleanor and Talon had determination and desperation. It would have to be enough. They found shelter in a stand of aspens as the sun climbed higher, the white bark of the trees gleaming like bone in the morning light. Talon insisted they rest, though Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept scanning the terrain below for signs of pursuit. Drink, he said, handing her the canteen. Eleanor's hand shook as she lifted it to her lips. The water was nearly gone, just a few swallows left. She took only what she needed and passed it back. We'll need to find more water soon, Talon said, reading her thoughts. There's a spring another day's travel north, if we can reach it. And if the soldiers find us first? Talon didn't answer, which was answer enough. Eleanor leaned back against an aspen trunk, her body screaming with exhaustion. Every muscle ached. Her feet were blistered and raw inside her ruined boots. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a real meal or slept for more than an hour at a time. 3 days ago, she'd been planning a wedding, worrying about flower arrangements and guest lists. Now she was a fugitive running for her life through mountain wilderness. The absurdity of it made her want to laugh, except she was too tired even for that. Tell me about Lieutenant Garrett, Talon said, settling beside her. How did you know he'd help? I didn't know, not for certain. Eleanor closed her eyes, seeing Garrett's face when she'd shown him the letter, the way horror and determination had warred in his expression. I just hoped. He's young, idealistic, the kind of officer who actually believes in honor and duty instead of just talking about them. When I showed him proof of what my father had done, I gambled that his conscience would matter more than his career. That was a dangerous gamble. Everything about this is dangerous. Eleanor opened her eyes and looked at Talon. But it was the right thing to do. He knew it, same as I did. Sometimes knowing something is right doesn't make it easier, but it makes it necessary. Talon studied her face, and Eleanor felt that strange current between them again, the thing she'd felt in the stockade when he'd first told her his name. Connection. Recognition. Something deeper than gratitude or circumstance. You could have stayed safe, he said quietly. Could have shown the letter to the territorial governor. Let the authorities handle it. You didn't have to run. The territorial governor is probably part of it. Victor mentioned connections all the way to Santa Fe. Eleanor shook her head. And even if he wasn't, even if I'd reported it through proper channels, what do you think would have happened? My father is a decorated colonel. Victor is one of the richest men in the territory. I'm just a woman with a piece of paper and a prisoner's word. They would have buried the evidence, discredited me, and hanged you anyway. So you chose to burn your life down instead. I chose to do something that mattered. Eleanor pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. All my life I've been decorative. The colonel's pretty daughter, raised to smile and curtsy and marry well and never cause trouble. I was so good at it, Talon, so perfect, and it was killing me inch by inch, turning me into someone I couldn't recognize in the mirror. She paused, surprised by her own honesty. She'd never said these things aloud before, never even fully articulated them to herself. "When I saw you in that stockade," she continued, "when I looked in your eyes and saw someone who refused to break even when breaking would have been easier, I realized I'd been broken my whole life and just never noticed. So no, I don't regret running. Even if they catch us, even if this ends badly, at least I'll know I tried to be whole." Talon was silent for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her cold ones. "You are whole," he said. "You've been whole all along. You just needed a reason to see it." Eleanor's throat tightened. She wanted to say something profound, something meaningful, but the words wouldn't come. So instead, she just held his hand and let the silence speak for both of them. They rested there as the morning aged into afternoon, taking turns keeping watch while the other dozed. Eleanor's sleep was fitful, filled with dreams of her father's face and Warren's whip and Victor's cold eyes. She woke with a gasp to find Talon's hand on her shoulder, his expression concerned. "You were dreaming," he said. "More like remembering." Eleanor sat up, pushing sweat-dampened hair from her face. "What time is it?" "Past noon. We should move soon. The soldiers will be regrouping, planning their next sweep." Talon handed her the last of the dried meat. "Eat this. We'll find more food when we reach my village, but for now, we need to keep our strength up." Eleanor chewed the tough meat mechanically, her mind already moving ahead to the challenges facing them. Another day and a half of travel through hostile terrain, pursued by soldiers who knew these mountains better than she did. And even if they reached Talon's village, what then? Would his people welcome a white woman who'd betrayed her own? Would they believe her story about the conspiracy? Would they even care? "What will you tell them?" Eleanor asked. "Your people?" "When we arrive." The truth." Talon finished packing their meager supplies. "That you risked everything to free me, that you brought evidence of the conspiracy against us, that you're under my protection." "Will that be enough?" "I'm still the Colonel's daughter, still part of the world that's trying to destroy them." "You stopped being the Colonel's daughter the moment you unlocked my chains." Talon met her eyes. "You're one of us now, Eleanor? Whether the soldiers catch us or we make it to my village, you're one of us. That's what matters." They set out again, following a route that took them along the spine of a ridge, where the trees thinned and the view opened up. Eleanor could see for miles in every direction. The desert they'd fled spread out to the south, the mountains rising to the north, the whole vast territory caught between sky and stone. Somewhere down there, her father was organizing the hunt. Somewhere, Victor was probably revising his plans, calculating how this disruption would affect his railroad timeline. Somewhere, the world she'd known was continuing without her, and Eleanor felt nothing but relief at its absence. "Look," Talon said, pointing. Eleanor followed his gesture and felt her stomach drop. Far below, moving along a parallel ridge, was a line of riders. At least 20 of them, spread out in a search formation, moving methodically north. "They're between us and your village," Eleanor said. "I know." Talon's jaw tightened. "We'll have to circle around them. It'll add time, but there's no other way." They changed course, angling west now, using the terrain to stay out of sight of the riders below. The detour took them through rougher country, all broken rock and steep drops that forced them to move slowly, carefully. Eleanor's boots were falling apart, the soles separating from the uppers with every step. Her dress was more holes than fabric. The elegant young woman who'd poured tea for Victor 4 days ago was gone, replaced by something harder and more elemental. As twilight approached, they found themselves at the edge of a deep canyon that cut east to west across their path. The walls were sheer rock, maybe 100 feet deep, with a river running silver at the bottom. "Canyon Rojo," Talon said, staring down. "I didn't think we'd come this far west. Can we cross it?" "Not here. The walls are too steep. We'll have to follow the rim until we find a way down and back up again." He looked at the fading light, calculation in his eyes. "That's hours we don't have. The soldiers will catch up." "Then what do we do?" Before Talon could answer, a voice rang out from behind them. "Don't move." Eleanor spun around. Lieutenant Garrett stood 20 feet away, his rifle leveled at them, his uniform dusty and his face haggard. He was alone. "Lieutenant?" Eleanor breathed. Garrett's rifle didn't waver. Miss Whitmore, step away from the prisoner. James, please, I said step away. His voice cracked. Your father has the entire fort out looking for you. Sergeant Warren has orders to bring back the Apache dead or alive. If you're with him when they find you, they won't distinguish between prisoner and accomplice. I am an accomplice, Eleanor said. I freed him. I ran with him. I'm not stepping away. Garrett's face twisted with anguish. Eleanor, listen to me. I helped you because I believed you about the letter, about the conspiracy. I still believe you. But this has gone too far. The colonel is talking about treason, about making examples. If you come back with me now, if you claim you were coerced, there's still a chance. A chance for what? To go back to being his property? To marry Victor and pretend I don't know what they've done? Eleanor stepped forward, and Garrett's rifle followed her. I won't do it, James. I can't. Then you'll hang. Garrett's voice broke. They'll execute you both, and it won't change anything. The railroad will still be built. The Apache will still be removed. All you'll accomplish is getting yourself killed. Maybe, Talon said, speaking for the first time. Or maybe we'll reach my village and use the evidence Eleanor took to expose what's happening. Maybe the territorial governor isn't part of it. Maybe there are enough good men like you, Lieutenant, who'll care about the truth. You're betting your lives on maybe, Garrett said. Better than betting them on certainty that we're wrong. Eleanor took another step forward. James, please, lower the rifle. You know this is wrong. You knew it when you helped us escape. Garrett's rifle trembled. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cooling air. I helped you because I thought you'd get away clean, thought you'd disappear, and the whole thing would blow over. I didn't think it through, didn't realize the colonel would react like this. How did he react? Like a man whose entire career just collapsed. Garrett's voice was hollow. He's not sleeping, barely eating, just standing over the maps, coordinating search parties, promising Victor he'll fix this. Warren says he's never seen the colonel so focused, so dangerous. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She'd always known her father was capable of ruthlessness. That was what made him an effective officer. But this was something else. This was personal. Then you understand why I can't go back, Eleanor said quietly. A man that dangerous, that fixated, won't forgive, won't show mercy. Even if I went back, even if I begged, he'd make sure I never had another chance to embarrass him. Garrett closed his eyes. I know. So help us. One more time, please. I can't. I've already done too much. If the colonel finds out I'm the one who cached the supplies, who told you about the ravine. He stopped, his face pale. They're watching me. Warren suspects. That's why I volunteered for the search party, to throw off suspicion. If I let you go now, if I come back empty-handed again, then don't come back empty-handed. Talon's voice was calm, almost gentle. Tell them you found us at the canyon. Tell them I threatened you, took your rifle, pushed you over the edge. You barely survived. By the time you made it back to report, we were gone. Garrett stared at him. You want me to lie to the colonel? To Warren? I want you to live. Talon spread his hands, showing he was unarmed. You helped us because your conscience demanded it. Now your conscience demands you protect yourself. There's no shame in that. There's plenty of shame in it. But Garrett's rifle was lowering inch by inch. If I do this, I'm finished. If they ever find out, they won't, Eleanor said. We won't tell. And if we make it to Talon's village, if we expose the conspiracy, you'll be a hero. The officer who saw through the lies and helped stop a massacre. And if you don't make it, then we're dead and you're safe. Either way, you win. Garrett laughed, a bitter sound. That's not winning, Eleanor. That's just surviving with guilt. Guilt is better than complicity. Eleanor held out her hand. Please, James, this is the last thing I'll ever ask of you. Garrett looked at her hand, at her face, at Talon standing silent and watchful behind her. Then, slowly, he lowered his rifle completely and handed it to Talon along with a pouch of ammunition. There's a narrow bridge about 2 miles west along the canyon rim, he said, his voice tight. Natural rock formation. Dangerous, but passable. Cross there, then head north. You'll hit the trade road that leads to the Apache territories. Follow it east, and you should reach the Red Creek settlement in a day. Maybe less. Thank you, Eleanor whispered. Garrett looked at her, really looked at her, and Eleanor saw the depth of his regret written plainly on his face. I hope you make it. I hope all of this means something in the end. So do I. Garrett turned to Talon. Keep her safe. Whatever else happens, keep her safe. I will. Talon extended his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Garrett shook it. Then the lieutenant walked to the canyon's edge, looked down at the drop, and closed his eyes. This is going to hurt. Wait, Eleanor said. You don't have to actually... But Garrett was already moving, throwing himself backward, rolling down the rocky slope that led to the canyon wall. He hit hard, tumbling over loose stones, sliding 20 feet before catching himself on a scrub juniper growing from the rocks. When he pulled himself up, his uniform was torn and his face was bloody, but he was alive. He looked up at them one last time, gave a small nod, then started the careful climb back to safer ground. Eleanor watched him go, her throat tight with guilt and gratitude. Another sacrifice, another price paid for her choices. Come on, Talon said gently. We need to move while we still have light. They followed the canyon rim west, the chasm yawning beside them like an open mouth. The rock bridge Garrett had described appeared just as the last rays of sunlight painted the canyon walls red and gold. It was exactly what he'd said. A natural formation, maybe 10 feet wide at its narrowest point, spanning the 100-foot drop. Eleanor looked at it and felt her stomach turn. That's the bridge? That's it. Talon tested the rock with his foot. It's solid, just don't look down. Easy for you to say. I'll go first. Follow exactly where I step. Keep your eyes on my back, not on the canyon. Talon started across, his movement sure and steady despite the drop on either side. Eleanor took a breath, said a silent prayer to no one in particular, and followed. The first few steps were manageable. Then the bridge narrowed and the wind picked up, and suddenly Eleanor was acutely aware of the empty air beneath her feet, the river far below reduced to a silver thread. Her head spun. Her foot slipped. Eleanor, eyes on me, Talon called back. Don't look down. Just focus on my voice and keep moving. Eleanor fixed her gaze on his shoulders and took another step. Then another. The wind pushed at her, trying to shove her sideways, but she leaned into it and kept going. Step by step, foot by foot, until finally she was across and on solid ground again. She collapsed against a boulder, her legs shaking. I hate heights. You did well. Talon helped her up. Come on, we need to put distance between us and the canyon before we stop for the night. They walked for another hour, the darkness deepening around them, until Talon found a sheltered spot among a tumble of boulders. They huddled together for warmth, the single blanket wrapped around both of them, and shared the last of their water. Tomorrow we reach the trade road, Talon said. After that, it's a straight shot to my village. And the soldiers? We'll have to give up the chase eventually. We're too far into Apache territory now. Even Warren won't risk a full company this deep into the backcountry. Eleanor wanted to believe him, but she'd seen the look in Garrett's eyes when he talked about her father's obsession. Colonel Nathaniel Whitmore didn't give up. Not ever. He'd chase them to the ends of the earth if that's what it took to restore his honor. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, she was alive, free, and sitting next to someone who saw her as a person rather than a possession. That would have to be enough. Tell me about your mother, Eleanor said. The one who makes the baskets. Talon smiled, the expression visible even in the darkness. Her name is Ayanna. It means eternal blossom. She's small but fierce, and she knows more about plants and medicines than anyone alive. When I was young, I used to follow her into the hills while she gathered materials for her baskets. She'd point out every plant, every flower, tell me what it was good for, how to use it. She sounds remarkable. She is. She's also stubborn as a mule and twice as mean when she's angry. His smile widened. You'll like her. The casual assumption that Eleanor would meet his mother, would be welcomed into his world, made her chest tight with emotion she couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe, or something deeper. What about your sister? Conti. She's 16 and thinks she's invincible. Best tracker in the band, and she won't let anyone forget it. Talon's voice was warm with affection. She'll probably challenge you to a tracking contest within 5 minutes of meeting you. I'll lose. Completely. but she'll respect that you tried. They talked into the night, Talon sharing stories of his people while Eleanor asked questions she'd never dared ask before. What was life really like for the Apache bands? How did they organize themselves? What did they believe about the world? Every answer chipped away at the prejudices Eleanor had absorbed without questioning, replacing them with a more complex, more human understanding. Eventually, exhaustion pulled Eleanor towards sleep. She leaned against Talon's shoulder, her eyes drifting closed. "Eleanor?" His voice was soft. Thank you. For everything. For seeing me as a person when everyone else saw an enemy. For risking your life. For—" He paused. "For being brave enough to choose truth over comfort." Eleanor's eyes opened. She lifted her head to look at him, and in the starlight she could just make out his features, strong and honest and entirely without pretense. "You're welcome," she whispered. And then, without thinking, without planning, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was gentle, tentative, more question than statement. Talon went still for a heartbeat. Then his hand came up to cup her face, and he kissed her back, and suddenly gentle wasn't enough. Eleanor's hands found his hair, his shoulders, pulling him closer. Talon's arms wrapped around her, strong and sure. And for the first time in days, maybe in her entire life, Eleanor felt completely safe. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Talon rested his forehead against hers. "That was— I know. We should— I know." But neither of them moved. They stayed there, wrapped in each other, and the blanket and the mountain darkness, and let the world fall away for a few stolen moments. Eventually they settled down to sleep, Eleanor tucked against Talon's side, his arms around her. As she drifted off, her last conscious thought was that she'd never felt more herself than she did right now, dirty, exhausted, wanted by the law, and completely, utterly free. Dawn came too quickly, pulling them from sleep with cold fingers. They rose stiff and aching, shared the last drops of water, and started moving north toward the trade road Garrett had described. The land changed as they descended from the higher elevations, the pine forest giving way to juniper and pinon, the rocky terrain softening into rolling hills. By mid-morning, they found the road, really just a dirt track worn by generations of traders moving between settlements. "We follow this east," Talon said. "Stay alert. The road means we might encounter other travelers, not all of them friendly." They walked in silence, conserving energy, scanning the horizon for threats. The sun climbed higher, beating down with relentless intensity. Eleanor's tongue felt thick in her mouth. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. She needed water desperately, but the canteen had been empty since dawn. Around noon, Talon stopped suddenly, his hand shooting out to halt Eleanor. "What is it?" "Riders, coming fast!" Eleanor heard them a moment later, the thunder of hooves getting closer. They dove off the road into a dry wash, pressing themselves flat against the sandy bottom. The riders passed above them. Not soldiers this time, but something worse, bounty hunters, their horses laden with supplies and weapons, their faces hard and hungry. Eleanor caught fragments of their conversation as they rode by. "Colonel's offering $1,000 for the Apache, dead or alive. 500 for the girl, but she has to be breathing. Easy money if we can find them before the army does." The voices faded. Eleanor and Talon lay motionless for several more minutes, making sure the riders were truly gone before climbing back to the road. "Bounty hunters," Eleanor said. "My father's putting out bounties now?" "Desperate men do desperate things." Talon scanned the road ahead. "We need to move faster. If there are bounty hunters this far out, more will follow." They picked up the pace, practically jogging now despite their exhaustion. The sun beat down mercilessly. Eleanor's vision started to blur at the edges, black spots dancing in her peripheral vision. She stumbled, caught herself, kept moving through pure willpower. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Talon stopped and pointed. "There. You see it?" Eleanor squinted against the glare. At first she saw nothing. Then gradually she made out structures in the distance, low buildings, cooking fires sending smoke into the sky, the movement of people. "Your village," she said. "My village." Talon's voice was thick with emotion. "We made it, Eleanor. We actually made it." They started forward, and Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, though she couldn't have said if they were from relief or exhaustion or the sheer overwhelming weight of everything that had happened. They were maybe half a mile from the village when the shot rang out. The bullet kicked up dust at Eleanor's feet. She froze, her heart stopping, as more riders appeared from behind a low ridge. Not bounty hunters this time. Soldiers, at least a dozen of them, fanning out to surround Eleanor and Talon. And at their head, sitting ramrod straight in his saddle, was Sergeant Warren. "End of the line," Warren called out. "Put down the rifle, Apache. Do it now, or we start shooting." Talon's hands tightened on the rifle Garrett had given him. Eleanor could see him calculating odds, distances, possibilities. They were so close. The village was right there. "Don't," Eleanor whispered. "Please. They'll kill you. They'll kill me anyway. Not if we surrender. Not if—" Another shot, this one closer. Warren's voice rang out again. "I said put it down. You've got 3 seconds. 1. Talon looked at Eleanor, his dark eyes full of regret and determination and something that looked like love. 2. "I'm sorry," he said. 3. Talon threw down the rifle and raised his hands. The soldiers closed in, rifles trained on both of them. Warren dismounted, his weathered face split in a triumphant smile. "Well, well, the colonel's daughter and her savage friend. You two led us on quite the chase." He gestured to his men. "Chain them both. We're taking them back to face justice." As rough hands grabbed Eleanor's arms and cold iron closed around her wrists, she looked past the soldiers toward the village. People had emerged from the buildings, drawn by the gunshots. They stood watching, too far away to help, as Eleanor and Talon were loaded onto horses and bound securely. They'd been so close. Less than a mile from safety, from allies, from the chance to expose the conspiracy. But close didn't matter. They'd been caught. Warren swung back into his saddle, looking pleased with himself. "The colonel's going to be very happy. Maybe happy enough to forget that you two made him look like a fool for the past 5 days. He spurred his horse forward. "Move out. We've got a long ride back to the fort, and I want to be there before the colonel changes his mind about wanting them alive." The soldiers rode out, their prisoners secured between them, heading back toward Fort Coyote Ridge and whatever judgment awaited them there. Eleanor looked back once, toward the village where Talon's people stood watching. She wondered if they understood what they were seeing, if they knew that the woman being taken away had tried to save one of their own, if it mattered. Then the village disappeared behind a ridge, and there was only the desert and the soldiers and the slow, inexorable journey back to the place where this had all begun. The journey back to Fort Coyote Ridge took 3 days that felt like 3 lifetimes. Warren kept them bound and separated. Eleanor on one horse with a soldier holding the reins, Talon on another 20 feet away. They weren't allowed to speak to each other, weren't allowed to do anything except ride in silence and contemplate their fates. Eleanor's mind raced through the long hours on horseback. The evidence was still hidden in her jewelry box. If her father found it, he'd destroy it. If he didn't, if somehow Eleanor could get word to someone who mattered, maybe there was still a chance. But who? The territorial governor was likely complicit. Victor controlled most of the local officials. Lieutenant Garrett was under suspicion and couldn't help without exposing himself. The only card Eleanor had left to play was the truth itself, spoken loudly enough that someone would have to listen. On the second night, when the soldiers made camp and Eleanor was chained to a wagon wheel far from the fire, Warren came to stand over her. "Your father's real torn up about this, you know," he said conversationally. "Can't decide if he's more angry or heartbroken." "I think it's about 50-50. Eleanor said nothing. "Me? I think you got what you deserved. Stupid girl, thinking she could run off with a savage and everything would work out fine." Warren spat into the dirt. "But the colonel, he still sees you as his daughter, still wants to give you a chance to make this right. By marrying Victor and pretending none of this happened? By accepting your punishment with grace and showing proper remorse?" Warren crouched down to her level. "The colonel's willing to be merciful if you cooperate. Tell everyone the Apache threatened you, forced you to help him escape. Say you were a victim. Do that, and you'll live. Might even avoid prison. And Talon? The Apache hangs. That was always going to happen. Nothing you can do about it." Eleanor met Warren's cold eyes. "Then I have nothing to say to my father, or to you." Warren's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake." "I've made several, But freeing Talon wasn't one of them. The sergeant stood, shaking his head, stubborn and stupid, just like your mother. He walked away, leaving Eleanor alone with her chains and her thoughts. She looked across the camp to where Talon sat against a tree, similarly bound. Their eyes met in the firelight, and even without words, Eleanor felt the connection between them, strong as iron, unbreakable as stone. Whatever happened at the fort, they'd face it together. Fort Coyote Ridge appeared on the horizon at midday on the third day, its walls rising from the desert like a tombstone. As they drew closer, Eleanor could see that the entire garrison had turned out to witness their return. Soldiers lined the walls, civilians clustered at the gates, everyone eager to see the traitor daughter and the Apache prisoner who'd made fools of them all. The gates swung open. Warren led the company through, and the crowd pressed in on all sides, shouting questions and insults. Eleanor kept her head high, refusing to show fear or shame. Beside her, Talon sat his horse with equal dignity, his face impassive despite the hatred being directed at him. In the center of the parade ground, Colonel Nathaniel Whitmore waited. He stood alone, his uniform perfect, his posture military straight, his face carved from granite. But Eleanor could see the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a week ago, the tightness in his jaw, the carefully controlled fury radiating from every inch of him. Warren dismounted and saluted. "Prisoners delivered as ordered, sir." "Put the Apache in the stockade," the colonel said without taking his eyes off Eleanor. "My daughter comes with me." Soldiers moved to obey. Eleanor was pulled from her horse, her chains removed, and suddenly her father's hand was on her arm, his grip like steel as he marched her across the parade ground toward the command house. The crowd parted before them, everyone falling silent as they passed. Inside the house, the colonel released Eleanor and closed the door with deliberate care. Then he turned to face her. "Explain yourself." Eleanor had rehearsed this moment in her mind 100 times during the journey back. She'd imagined pleading, explaining, trying to make him understand. But now, standing in front of the man who'd raised her and lied to her and ordered the deaths of innocent people, all those carefully prepared words evaporated. "There's nothing to explain," she said. "I helped Talon escape because he's innocent. Because you and Victor framed him for a massacre you orchestrated. Because everything about this is corrupt and wrong, and I won't be part of it." Her father's face remained impassive. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about. I read the letter, Father. The one in your office, in the Harlan Group correspondence file. The strategic incident report about the Culver homestead. You ordered that attack. You planned it down to the last detail, all to create justification for removing the Apache from land Victor wants for his railroad." Something flickered in the colonel's eyes. Not surprise, he was too controlled for that. But recognition, acknowledgement. "Even if such a letter existed," he said carefully, "which I'm not confirming, it would be classified military correspondence. Accessing it would be a court-martial offense. Then court-martial me. Put me on trial. Make me testify under oath about what I found." Eleanor stepped closer. "Make me explain to a military tribunal exactly what you've done. I'm sure they'd be very interested." "You think anyone would believe you?" Her father's voice was soft, dangerous. "You're a hysterical girl who ran off with a prisoner, who aided a known enemy combatant, who betrayed her family, her country, everything she was raised to honor. Your credibility is destroyed, Eleanor. Anything you say now sounds like the desperate lies of a woman trying to avoid consequences. Maybe. Or maybe I'm telling the truth and you're a murderer trying to protect his career." The colonel's hand moved so fast Eleanor barely saw it. The slap cracked across her face, snapping her head to the side, leaving her cheek burning and her eyes watering. "You will not speak to me that way," he said, his voice still terrifyingly calm. "I am still your father, still your commanding officer. You will show respect." Eleanor touched her stinging cheek, tasted blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her mouth. But she didn't back down, didn't lower her eyes. "You were my father," she said. "But that man died when he ordered the Culver children killed. I don't know who you are now, but you're not the man who raised me." They stood facing each other in the dim hallway, the space between them vast despite the physical proximity. Eleanor could see her father struggling with himself, decades of military discipline warring against paternal rage and wounded pride. "The Apache hangs tomorrow at noon," he said finally. "You'll be present. You'll watch what happens to enemies of the state. Then you'll be transported to Santa Fe to face charges of treason and aiding the enemy. Victor has agreed to testify that you were coerced, that you were a victim of the prisoner's manipulation. If you cooperate, if you show proper contrition, the territorial court might show leniency. I won't cooperate. I won't lie for you. Then you'll hang beside your savage friend. Her father's voice was flat, empty of emotion. The choice is yours, Eleanor. Contrition and life, or defiance and death. Decide by tomorrow morning. He turned and walked down the hallway toward his office, his boots echoing on the polished floor. Eleanor watched him go, and the finality of it settled over her like a shroud. There would be no reconciliation, no understanding, no bridge back to what they'd been. That relationship was dead, killed by truth and choices neither of them could take back. A soldier appeared to escort Eleanor to her room. She went without protest, too numb and exhausted to fight. Her bedroom looked exactly as she'd left it: lace curtains, flower paintings, the vanity with its bottles and ribbons, a perfect cage for a perfect daughter who no longer existed. Eleanor went straight to the vanity and opened her jewelry box. The false bottom was undisturbed, and beneath it, the copied pages of her father's letter lay exactly where she'd hidden them. He hadn't found them. Either he hadn't thought to look, or he'd been too focused on recapturing his prisoners to search her room thoroughly. She pulled out the pages and read them again, the damning words stark in black ink. This was proof. This was truth. But what could she do with it now? She was a prisoner in her own room, soldiers posted outside her door, the execution scheduled for tomorrow. Eleanor sank onto her bed, the pages clutched in her hands, and tried to think through the exhaustion and fear. There had to be a way. Some move left to make. She hadn't come this far, risked this much, only to fail at the last moment. A soft knock on her door made her jump. She shoved the pages under her pillow as the door opened and Mrs. Kowalski entered carrying a tray of food. "I thought you might be hungry, miss," the housekeeper said quietly. Eleanor wasn't hungry, couldn't imagine eating, but she nodded anyway. "Thank you, Mrs. Kowalski." The housekeeper set down the tray, then paused, glancing back at the open door where a soldier stood guard. She moved closer to Eleanor, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "There's folks in town talking, miss, about what really happened, about that letter you supposedly found." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "How do they know about the letter?" "Lieutenant Garrett. Before the colonel put him under house arrest, he told a few people he trusted. Word spread." Mrs. Kowalski's weathered face was grave. "Some folks don't believe it, but some do. There's questions being asked about the railroad, about the land deals, about why the colonel's so desperate to execute that Apache boy. Does my father know people are talking? If he does, he's not showing it. But Mr. Harlan knows. He rode in from Santa Fe this morning, looking like someone stole his horse. He's been in the colonel's office for hours." Eleanor's mind raced. If people were talking, if word was spreading, maybe all wasn't lost. Maybe the truth could still matter. "Mrs. Kowalski, I need you to do something for me." The housekeeper's eyes widened. "Miss, I can't help you escape again. They'd hang me alongside you." "I'm not asking you to help me escape. I'm asking you to deliver a letter." Eleanor pulled the copied pages from under her pillow. "These are copies of correspondence between my father and Victor Harlan. They prove the Culver massacre was staged to justify land seizure. I need these to reach someone in authority who isn't part of the conspiracy." "Who would that be, miss?" "The territorial governors in Victor's pocket, the federal marshals 200 miles away. By the time these reach anyone who matters, you and that Apache boy will be dead." "Then they need to reach someone who can make noise. A newspaper editor, a circuit judge, someone who'll care enough about the truth to shout it from the rooftops, even if it comes too late to save us." Eleanor pressed the pages into Mrs. Kowalski's hands. "Please, I'm not asking for myself anymore. I'm asking for every Apache family that's going to be displaced by that railroad. Every person who'll suffer because powerful men decided profit matters more than human lives." Mrs. Kowalski looked down at the papers, her face torn. "If I'm caught, you won't be. You're just a housekeeper bringing supplies to town. No one pays attention to you. That's what makes you perfect." The older woman hesitated a moment longer. Then she folded the papers carefully and tucked them into her apron pocket. "There's an editor at the Santa Fe Gazette who's always writing about government corruption. Samuel Birch. He doesn't like the territorial governor, doesn't like the railroad companies. If anyone would publish this, it'd be him. Then get these to him. However you can. As fast as you can. Mrs. Kowalski nodded and turned to leave, then paused at the door. For what it's worth, miss, I think you did the right thing. That Apache boy's no murderer. Anyone with eyes can see it. She left, and Eleanor was alone again with her thoughts and her prayers that a housekeeper's courage would be enough. Night fell over Fort Coyote Ridge. Eleanor lay on her bed, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the fort settling into uneasy sleep. Tomorrow at noon, Talon would die. Tomorrow afternoon, Eleanor would begin her journey to Santa Fe and whatever judgment awaited her there. Unless something changed, unless the letter reached Samuel Birch in time, unless the spreading rumors turned into something more substantial than whispers, unless, maybe. Hope built on nothing but desperate possibility. Eleanor must have dozed because she woke to the sound of shouting outside. She ran to the window and looked out at the parade ground where soldiers were running toward the main gate. Torches flickered in the darkness. More shouting, urgent and alarmed. Then the gates opened and riders poured through. Not soldiers this time. Apache warriors, maybe 20 of them, their faces painted, their weapons ready. And at their head, Eleanor recognized the people she'd seen watching from Talon's village when she and Talon were captured. The soldiers formed up quickly, rifles aimed at the intruders. Colonel Whitmore appeared on the command house steps, his uniform hastily donned, his face thunderous. "This is a military installation," he shouted. "You're trespassing on federal land. Leave now or face the consequences." One of the Apache warriors urged his horse forward. He was older than the others, his face marked with scars, his bearing that of a leader. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear. "We come for the one you hold, the one called Talon. He is our son, our blood. You have no right to him. He's a prisoner of war, charged with murder and raiding. He'll be executed tomorrow according to military law." "There was no murder, no raid." The warrior's voice rang out across the parade ground. "Your accusations are lies meant to steal our land. We know this. The woman who ran with our son told us this before your soldiers took them." Eleanor's breath caught. She hadn't told them anything. She'd never gotten close enough to speak to anyone in the village, but apparently someone else had. Movement at the edge of the crowd caught her attention. Lieutenant Garrett, still in his torn and bloodied uniform from his fall at the canyon, was standing near the gates. As Eleanor watched, he stepped forward and saluted her father. "Sir, I need to speak. It's urgent." "Not now, Lieutenant. We have a situation. The situation is my fault, sir." Garrett's voice was steady, despite the fear Eleanor could see in his face. "The Apache are right. There was no raid. The Culver Massacre was a staged operation designed to justify land seizure for the railroad. I have proof. Documents. Correspondence between you and Victor Harlan outlining the entire conspiracy." The parade ground went silent. Every eye turned to Garrett, then to the colonel. "Lieutenant, you're clearly suffering from the effects of your injury," Colonel Whitmore said carefully. "You're not thinking clearly. Report to the infirmary immediately." "I'm thinking perfectly clearly, sir." Garrett pulled folded papers from his jacket. Not the copies Eleanor had given Mrs. Kowalski, but different ones. "Before I cached supplies for Miss Whitmore and the prisoner, I made additional copies of the documents she showed me. I've been holding them, trying to decide what to do. When I saw the Apache riding for the fort, I knew it was time." "Give me those papers, Lieutenant. That's an order." "No, sir. With respect, I won't." Garrett turned to face the assembled soldiers and civilians. "Everyone needs to hear this. The colonel and Victor Harlan conspired to murder the Culver family and frame the Apache for it. They did it to create justification for forcibly removing the Red Creek Band from land Harlan wants for railroad development. The Apache prisoner is innocent. Miss Whitmore discovered the truth and freed him because executing an innocent man to cover up murder is wrong. I helped her because my conscience demanded it." The murmuring started then, soldiers and civilians alike processing what they'd just heard. Eleanor saw doubt on some faces, anger on others, confusion on most. Victor Harlan pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with rage. "This is ridiculous. The ramblings of a disgraced officer trying to save his career. Colonel, arrest this man immediately." "Let him speak," a voice called from the crowd. More voices joined it. Let's hear what he's got to say. Show us the papers. Colonel Whitmore's hand moved to his sidearm. For a moment, Eleanor thought he might actually draw it, might shoot Garrett right there in front of everyone. But the colonel was too smart for that, too aware that the situation was slipping out of his control. Fine, he said coldly. Speak your piece, Lieutenant. Destroy your career. See if anyone believes you. Garrett began reading from the documents. The strategic incident report. The timeline for the staged raid. The correspondence about land acquisition and indigenous removal. Every damning word spoken clearly, projected to reach every ear in the fort. As he read, Eleanor saw the mood shift, saw doubt turn to shock, shock turn to anger. These were soldiers who'd believed they were fighting for justice, protecting settlers from hostile raiders. Now they were learning they'd been tools in a land theft scheme. When Garrett finished, the silence was absolute. Then someone in the crowd spoke up. I knew something was wrong about that Culver scene. The bodies were laid out too neat, too staged. Another voice joined in. And the tracks leading away didn't match Apache patterns. I said so at the time, but Warren told me to keep my mouth shut. More voices, more doubts. The dam breaking as people who'd noticed inconsistencies finally felt safe speaking up. Victor Harlan saw the tide turning and tried to stop it. These are forgeries, obvious fabrications designed to undermine legitimate business development. The colonel and I have broken no laws. The railroad project is vital to territorial growth, and if some unfortunate incidents occurred in service of progress. Unfortunate incidents? The Apache leader's voice cut through like a blade. You speak of murdered children as unfortunate incidents? I speak of necessary sacrifices for civilization. Then your civilization is built on blood and lies. The warrior looked at Colonel Whitmore. Release our son, or we take him. This fort cannot stand against the combined bands if we call them. You know this. It was a bluff, probably. Even combined, the Apache bands couldn't take a fortified military installation. But the colonel didn't know how many warriors waited beyond the walls, didn't know if this was a raid or the opening move in a larger war. And more importantly, he no longer had the moral high ground. His own soldiers were looking at him with suspicion, with dawning horror at what they'd been complicit in. Father, please. Eleanor's voice rang out from her window. All heads turned toward her. Please, let Talon go. Admit what you've done. It's over. The truth is out. Dragging this forward will only make it worse. Colonel Whitmore looked up at his daughter, and for just a moment, Eleanor saw something break in his eyes. Pain. Regret. The realization that he'd gambled everything on maintaining control and lost. Then the moment passed, and his face hardened again. Never. I serve the interests of this nation. Everything I've done has been in service of progress, of expansion, of the future. If that requires difficult choices, so be it. I won't apologize for doing what was necessary. Then you're a coward, Eleanor said. You hide behind duty and necessity because you can't face what you really are. A murderer, a liar, a man who valued his ambition more than innocent lives. Silence! Her father's roar echoed across the parade ground. I am still the commanding officer of this fort. I will not be lectured by my own daughter. Guards, return Miss Whitmore to her room and post double watch. As for the rest of you, he swept his gaze across the assembled crowd. The execution proceeds as scheduled tomorrow at noon. Any man who interferes will be shot. Any Apache who remains on fort grounds past sunrise will be considered hostile. This matter is closed. But it wasn't closed. Eleanor could see it in the faces of the soldiers, in the way they looked at their colonel with uncertainty rather than respect. Could see it in the civilians whispering among themselves, in the Apache warriors who made no move to leave. The truth was out, messy and incomplete, but out. And once released, truth couldn't be recaptured. What happened next, though, no one could have predicted. A rider came thundering through the gates, his horse lathered and exhausted. He wore the uniform of a federal marshal, and he carried dispatches in an official leather case. Colonel Whitmore, he gasped, dismounting. Emergency orders from the territorial governor's office. Actually, he paused, catching his breath. Orders from the federal circuit judge in Santa Fe. You're to cease all executions and land seizure operations pending investigation into allegations of fraud and murder. Victor Harlan went white. That's impossible. The governor assured me. The governor's been arrested, the marshal said, about 6 hours ago. Seems a newspaper editor named Samuel Birch received documentary evidence of a conspiracy involving railroad land fraud, staged massacres, and judicial corruption. The story broke this afternoon. By evening, federal marshals were making arrests across Santa Fe. Your name's on the warrant list, Mr. Harlan. Victor turned and ran. He made it maybe 10 steps before Apache warriors blocked his path. He reversed direction, ran toward the stables, but soldiers, his own soldiers, closed ranks against him. There was nowhere to go. The marshal pulled out iron cuffs. Victor Harlan, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and corruption. Colonel Whitmore, I have orders to place you in federal custody as well pending investigation. Eleanor watched from her window as her father's world collapsed. Watched as the marshal cuffed him, as soldiers he'd commanded for years stood by and did nothing to help him. Watched as the man who'd controlled every aspect of her life was led away in chains. She should have felt triumphant, should have felt vindicated. Instead, she just felt hollow. The marshal looked around the parade ground, his eyes finding Eleanor at her window. Miss Eleanor Whitmore? Yes? I have orders to release the Apache prisoner into the custody of his people, and to inform you that all charges against you have been dropped. The circuit judge reviewed the evidence and determined you acted to prevent a miscarriage of justice. You're free to go, ma'am. Free. The word seemed impossible after everything. Eleanor left her room and walked down to the parade ground in a daze. The soldiers parted before her, some avoiding her eyes, others nodding with what looked like respect. She made her way to the stockade where the marshal was unlocking the door. Talon emerged into the torchlight, squinting against the brightness. His eyes found Eleanor immediately, and the relief on his face was so profound it made her chest ache. You did it, he said. We did it, Eleanor corrected. The Apache leader who'd challenged her father approached them. Up close, Eleanor could see the intelligence in his weathered face, the strength tempered by wisdom. You are the one who helped my son, he said. I am. You gave up everything for truth, for justice. He studied her for a long moment. That takes courage. My people honor courage. I only did what was right. Many people know what is right. Few have the strength to choose it when the cost is high. He turned to Talon. Is this the woman you told us about? The one you wish to bring home? Talon looked at Eleanor, a question in his eyes. If she'll come, if she wants to. Eleanor thought about the fort, about her father in chains, about the life she'd known crumbling to dust, thought about the empty rooms of the command house, the whispers that would follow her if she stayed, the stares and judgment and endless questions. Then she thought about the village she'd glimpsed from a distance, about Talon's mother who made watertight baskets and his sister who could track anything, about a life built on honesty instead of lies, on community instead of isolation, on choosing truth even when it hurt. I want to, she said. Talon took her hand. Then let's go home. They left Fort Coyote Ridge that night, Eleanor riding behind Talon on his horse, surrounded by warriors who'd come to rescue one of their own and ended up saving two. As they passed through the gates, Eleanor looked back once at the place that had shaped her entire existence. The command house stood dark and empty. Her father was gone, Victor was in custody, and the conspiracy they'd built together was unraveling with every passing hour. Lieutenant Garrett stood on the parade ground, watching them leave. Eleanor raised her hand in farewell, and he saluted in return. Then the fort fell behind them, and there was only the desert and the stars and the promise of something new ahead. The journey to the Red Creek settlement took 2 days. When they arrived, Talon's mother came running from one of the dwellings, tears streaming down her face as she pulled her son into a fierce embrace. His sister whooped and danced circles around them. The whole village turned out to celebrate the return of one who'd been lost. Eleanor hung back, uncertain of her welcome. But Talon's mother released her son and turned to Eleanor, studying her with dark eyes that saw everything. You are the one, she said in careful English, the one who chose honor over blood. I'm Eleanor. I am Ayanna. She took Eleanor's hands in hers. My son's life is precious to me. The fact that you valued it when your own people did not tells me everything I need to know about your heart. You are welcome here. You are family. The word broke something loose in Eleanor's chest. Family. Not through obligation or duty, but through choice and courage and the recognition of shared humanity. Over the following weeks, Eleanor learned what it meant to belong to a community, rather than exist as an ornament in someone else's world. She learned to help with daily tasks, gathering plants for medicine, preparing meals, tending fires. She learned words in the Apache language, stumbling over pronunciations that made the children giggle. She learned that strength came in many forms, and the kind that mattered most was the strength to be honest about who you were. Talon taught her to track, to read the land, to move through wilderness with confidence instead of fear. They spent long hours talking about everything and nothing, building understanding the way one builds a fire, carefully, patiently, feeding it until it could sustain itself. 6 months later, news reached the settlement that Colonel Nathaniel Whitmore had been convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to 20 years in a territorial prison. Victor Harlan had received 30 years. The railroad project had been canceled, the land acquisition reversed. The Red Creek Band's territory was protected by federal treaty. Eleanor read the news with complex emotions. Relief that justice had been served. Sadness for the father she'd lost, or perhaps had never really had. Gratitude that the truth had mattered enough in the end. A year after leaving Fort Coyote Ridge, Eleanor and Talon were married in a ceremony that blended Apache traditions with Eleanor's own sense of commitment and purpose. They built a small home on the edge of the settlement, where the canyon walls rose red and gold in the sunset and water ran clear from mountain springs. Lieutenant James Garrett visited once, bringing news from the outside world. He'd been promoted for his role in exposing the conspiracy, had been reassigned to a post in Colorado. He looked at Eleanor and Talon's home, at the way they moved together with easy familiarity, and smiled. "You look happy," he said to Eleanor. "I am," she realized. "For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." 2 years after that, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter with Talon's dark eyes and Eleanor's stubborn chin. They named her Ayanna, after Talon's mother, and raised her in a world where both her heritages mattered, where truth was valued over convenience, where courage meant choosing what was right instead of what was easy. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when Ayanna slept and the fire burned low, Eleanor would tell Talon about the girl she'd been. The colonel's daughter who'd poured tea and worried about wedding dresses and never questioned the world she lived in. "She seems like a stranger now," Eleanor said one night, watching flames dance in the darkness. "She was," Talon agreed. "The woman you are now, the one who chose truth over comfort, who walked away from everything to stand for what mattered. She's the real you. That girl was just who they wanted you to be." Eleanor leaned against him, feeling his warmth, his steadiness. Outside, the canyon country stretched endlessly under stars that had witnessed everything: her flight, her transformation, her choice to burn down a false life and build a true one from the ashes. Years later, when Ayanna was old enough to understand, Eleanor would tell her daughter the full story. Would explain that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was admit they'd been wrong, that the life they were living was built on lies, that changing course took more courage than staying the path. She'd tell Ayanna about a stockade and a prisoner and a moment of recognition that changed everything. About mountains and rivers and a desperate flight toward truth. About the price of choosing justice and the reward of choosing love. And she'd tell her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to move forward despite it. That truth mattered even when it cost everything. That a single choice, made in darkness with trembling hands, could light a path to a better world. The fire would burn low as she spoke, stars wheeling overhead, and her daughter would listen with wide eyes to the story of how her mother became herself. How Eleanor Whitmore, the colonel's daughter, died so that someone truer and stronger could rise from her remains. In the end, that was the story Eleanor wanted to pass down. Not one of a perfect heroine who never doubted, but of a flawed woman who made mistakes, who struggled, who ultimately chose the harder right over the easier wrong. And in that choice, found freedom, found home, found herself. The desert wind whispered through the canyon, carrying with it the scent of sage and possibility. Eleanor stood at the door of her home, watching her daughter chase butterflies in the fading light, and felt the weight of peace settle over her like a benediction. This was the life she'd fought for, the truth she'd nearly died to defend, the future she'd chosen when she unlocked those chains and stepped into darkness with only courage as her compass. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.